The Quantum Archangel. Craig Hinton. I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you. Malvolio, 12th Night. His sins will find their punishment in due time. Razalon, the Five Doctors. And thus the whirligig of time brings in his revenges. Fester, 12th Night. The Quantum Mechanics. Gods. She had been there for an eternity. Then again, what was eternity to an eternal? Stars could burn and die, galaxies could collide, timelines could converge and collapse. But Elektra would wait out her long silent vigil in the depths of the darker strata. Elektra knew that she would be undisturbed there. The darker strata, the deepest levels of the time vortex, were ignored by all the Eternals, their cousins the Chronovores, the mysterious time wraiths with their insane appetites, the swimmers mindlessly pressing against the multiversal boundaries. All the transcendental beings shunned the darkness, preferring their upper levels or the sixfold realm itself. But the dim, turbid streams of their darker strata were the perfect place for an Eternal who didn't want to be found. And Elektra most certainly did not want to be found. Like all the transcendental beings, the Eternals had existed since before the universe had formed, an eternity in the most literal sense. Abandoned by their parents, they had been left to forge their own path, but it was a path that Elektra rejected. Not for her the endless hunt for lesser beings to fulfill her life, not for her the need for ephemeral thoughts and desires to give purpose to her existence. No, Elektra knew what she wanted. But what Elektra wanted was forbidden by the ancient covenants that bound the transcendental beings. Because Elektra wanted fulfillment. Once, long ago, within the abyssal confines of the darker strata, she had found that fulfillment. And she would do again, so very, very soon. Because, for the first time since the remnants of the Big Bang had hung in their vortex like veils of preternatural fire, since the transcendental beings had found themselves in their new home, Elektra had found one simpatico to her needs and her wishes. As if in response to her reverie, the dark of the abyss began to stir. It began to curdle into patterns of time, space and reality, new regions of space-time, bubbling down through the substrates to the close reaches of the darker strata, permitting a heavily built figure of fire and ice to penetrate Elektra's oubliette. His wings outstretched in greeting. Elektra responded, creating a spiral spectrum of turbulence in colors that could only be seen in the time vortex, and then only by gods. But Elektra was a god, and so was her consort, Prometheus. As he approached, his mind began to burn within hers as hers did within his. Minds of unimaginable complexity and reach, also minds of imagination, a concept that their fellow Eternals and Chronovores simply couldn't comprehend. For theirs was a marriage that screamed in the face of the ancient covenants. She was of the eternal caste, those who drifted mindlessly, seeking out other imaginations, other lives, to lead and to leech from. Occasionally, if the boredom grew too great, they would be drawn to the games, where the Council of Guardians or the less aloof old gods would organize tournaments and entrapments for them, but most of their time was spent looking for others, for those who led real lives, who could fulfill that great longing that was the Eternals' curse. But not Elektra. As far as she knew, she was unique. The only Eternal who lacked the great longing for external fulfillment. But there was another longing, another need. One that required succor from another who could meet her on her own plane. Not one from the Brotherhood and Sisterhood of the Eternals, but from another source. The dark caste of the Chronovores. Segregated at birth, they had been consigned to exile just because they failed to meet the standards of the council. Damn the ancient covenants. She looked at Prometheus, radiant, magnificent. She found it hard to reconcile that with their covenant description of the Chronovores. According to the council's ruling, the Chronovores were nothing but vampires, subsisting on the primal energies of the sixfold realm, only truly living by drawing the life essence from the moments of choice, where they could thrive on the what-ifs and the what-might-have-beens, keeping this cosmos alone in their multiverse. An empty existence, a life of loneliness. Just like the Eternals. But not Electra and Prometheus. Not them. As he approached her through their murk of the darker strata, tendrils of thought stroked the outer edges of her mind, reinforcing her belief in him. Reinforcing her. Electra and Prometheus. Eternal and Chronovore. They had broken the rules. Because they were the future. And their forbidden needs and desires would forge that future. With his imagination and her primal strength, they would lead their estranged families to a common ground, to a place where all the transcendental beings could live together with the races spawned by this universe. The humans, the Gallifreyans, the Daleks. They would all have their part to play, as would those transcendental beings that had stolen away into the hidden places, regions of the multiverse that were even more remote than the darker strata, beings that had seen the universe as a challenge to be conquered, a people to be raped, an artifact of so high a price that they would destroy everything to possess it. The great intelligence, the Nestine consciousness, the animus. Especially the darkest and greatest of the old ones, Nyarlathotep. After what he had done, Electra had a special place in hell reserved for him. All of them, hiding and waiting like spiders in their vile webs. They would be the enemy. That was her driving purpose. Such evil needed to be fought, and for that, time would need a champion. A champion that Electra and Prometheus would give their wonderfully united universe, a champion that grew within her. Their child. Avatar. Their child would be the being who would unite all of sentience under one banner, whose dual heritage would show that this new universe was to be shared for the betterment of all. A mission led by Electra and Prometheus. Electra, my love. He was with her now, his body conjoining with the radiant aura which surrounded her. Eternals and Chronovores were built from matrices of exotic particles, resonating superstrings that gave them power and majesty, and Electra gasped as those matrices intertwined. But their feelings were their particles for that. If there weren't, then Electra and Prometheus would create them. The moment approaches, my love. Our child will be magnificent. Prometheus. Wings enfolded her, allowing them both to feel the embryonic consciousness within her, communicating with them on a level that was almost impossible to detect. But they could detect it. And Electra could tell that their child's epiphany was imminent. An epiphany for the universe. A new universe, overseen by Electra and Prometheus. They would be the parents of a new dawn, a new era. Thoughts of the future and their unborn child were thrown aside as the Stygian gloom of the darker strata was suddenly illuminated by a brilliance that defied description. For the first time since the Big Bang had lit the vortex, the darker strata were dark no longer. They were filled by a light that was even darker. They had found them. Even in the darker strata, they had found them. Electra and Prometheus may have been gods, but there were greater gods. Beings at the very pinnacle of existence, at the summit of the cosmic hierarchy. The Guardians. Elektra had never seen anything like it in her long, so very long, life. And she knew that few others in the universe had either. Thankfully, the entire Council of Guardians, 6 burning figures of wrath and vengeance, of power and unimaginable majesty. A sixfold God. A sixfold God for a sixfold realm. You have transgressed the ancient covenant, they said, 6 voices as one. You have broken the very laws of the continuum. You will all be punished. Elektra and Prometheus remained silent. There was nothing to say, nothing to do. Together, the Guardians could bend reality, fashion space and time to their whims. To them, a Chronovore and an Eternal were insects, less than insects. And then Elektra realized what they meant, what they intended to do. She screamed her defiance, her cries tearing through the vortex, powerful enough to shred matter down to the quark level. But to the Council of Guardians it was nothing more than a summer breeze. They had decided. Now they would act. Without further discussion they handed down their sentence. Prometheus was the first to be punished for his sins. Acting in meta-concert, the Council of Guardians was the most powerful force in the universe. In many respects they were the universe. Effortlessly, they took Prometheus' timeline and unraveled it, string by superstring, back and back. Elektra could do nothing, even if she had dared to defy the Council. Its massed energies were freezing her in stasis. She could only observe as her lover, her partner, her mate, was unpicked from the fabric of space-time. She could feel Prometheus' mind convulsing in agony, reaching out for her in a single long moment of need, before he ceased to exist. Before he ceased to ever have existed. The time vortex turned inside out as it came to terms with its fundamental nature being disturbed, before finally calming down into the blackness of the darker strata. Painfully, Elektra's attention turned from the nothingness that had been one half of her life, anger igniting within her. Even though Prometheus had never been, his memory, his seed, would live on within her avatar. Even the Guardians could not rob her of that. Calm yourself. You will not be hurt. Yet. It is the child we want. No. Not the Avatar. She was still screaming as the first phalanx of the Eternals, her family, descended from their hiding places and took her away. They say she never stopped screaming. And monsters. Murder was too small a word for it. You've killed them, Mel whispered, turning away in distress. She looked at their doctor through tear-blurred eyes. All of them. Single quote. The shutters closed over their image on the scanner with a nonchalance that belied the utter carnage that lay outside. Billions of people were now dead or dying beneath the sickly, scintillating green of a poisoned sky, their once verdant planet nothing more than a ball of radioactive slag hanging in space. The clear blue waters that had once girdled it were stinking brown liquid graves, brimming full with the bobbing corpses of all marine life. The fruitful garden belt was blindly glazed with the obsidian residue of countless nuclear ground zeros. The stately avenues of trees that had lined the capital city were nothing but charred fingers grasping for a hope that no longer remained. Maradnias wasn't quite dead, but only the last rites remained. Even now, Mel wasn't sure how it had happened. She and the doctor had arrived on the planet full of hopeful optimism, confident of averting the possible civil war that had threatened to disrupt it. The doctor had commented as they materialized that the civil war was never going to be more than a small scale affair, a mere bagatelle in his cosmic crusade. He just felt that it was his responsibility to stop even those few deaths. But now, what had gone wrong on Maradnias? She turned from the blind scanner and stared at the doctor through moist eyes. His tall figure, incongruously dressed in that tasteless red and yellow jacket, was bent over the hexagonal central console, but the strain was clear, even from behind. His broad shoulders were slumped, his head of curly blonde hair was bowed in defeat, despair. But those were purely human emotions. And the doctor wasn't human, Mel had to remind herself. However human he looked, however human he acted, the doctor was anything but. Mel was, and although the last thing the doctor wanted was an interrogation, she couldn't help herself. She had to know. With the ghoulish interest of someone watching a car crash, she felt the words slip from her mouth. What happened? The doctor didn't look up from the console as he answered, his voice low, sepulchral. I miscalculated, he muttered to the monitors and keyboards. I didn't realize how strong the anti-federalist faction was, or that they'd be idiotic enough to use their nuclear stockpile. Mel couldn't let him continue. Not anymore. You miscalculated. She exclaimed. This isn't an exercise in mental arithmetic, Doctor. The tears were still flowing, but her sorrow was subsiding into uncharacteristic anger. Billions of people have died because of you, billions of innocent lives. All gone, all because you miscalculated. This time, he did turn round and Mel was momentarily silenced by the tears that were streaming down his face. Don't you think I feel it too, Mel? He bellowed, thumping his chest. Don't you think I'll carry the blame for this for the rest of my life? The weight of their entire universe was carried on his voice, threatening to make it crack, threatening to make the doctor crack. But Mel didn't care, it was no less than he deserved. In spite of the doctor's obvious distress, unexpected venom colored Mel's next words, feelings that had been bottled up for months now spilling over without restraint, without a care as to their effect. No, Doctor, I don't. Who knows what Time Lords feel? What you feel? You go on about the Daleks, the Cybermen, the Vervoid, creatures that you blame for spreading untold misery and destruction. But if you ask me, you want the universe to be filled with evil. Single quote. The doctor reeled back at the intensity of Mel's words, but she didn't even slow down. The words needed to be said, if only for her sake. Those creatures only seem to exist to justify your own crusade. If it wasn't for them, you'd have no moral high ground to preach from, would you? And that wouldn't suit their doctor, great and glorious righter of wrongs, would it? She span on her heels and moved towards the internal door, but her outburst couldn't be contained. Even in retreat, she stopped in the open doorway, her back to the doctor. The words still needed to be said, and she turned to face him, her eyes blazing. Well, you're just as bad. No, you're worse. At least they admit what they're doing, and don't try to justify. No, to whitewash it like you do. She pointed at the closed scanner. 1 billion people are dead because you thought you could play God, Doctor, and I'm sick of it. Find another disciple. Her courage failing, Mel ran from the console room, the heels of her shoes clattering down the sterile corridor. The doctor made no move to follow her. Instead he reached out and activated the scanner, gazing impassionately at the fatally wounded surface of Maradnias. Mel had just reached the door to her room when she heard the noise, echoing through the white-walled, round-eled corridors. It was the Doctor. Screaming. Screaming. It wasn't until he slammed his fist on the lever and closed the great doors that he realized the screams he could hear were coming from his own mouth. Taking the deep breath, he willed himself to fight the pain, reminding himself that he had suffered far, far worse in his many lives. But that was of little reassurance. Every nerve fiber burnt with the effects of the blast, every inch of his skin was blistered and blackened. Forcing his charred fingers to obey him, he operated the controls, watching as the time rotor began to rise and fall as his TARDIS was once more enfolded in the protection of the time vortex. At last he was safe. Stepping back from the ebony control console, the Master slipped into the shadows of a nearby chair, trying to marshal his thoughts. As business deals went, that hadn't been one of his more glorious successes. His employers had seen through his ruse, and had double-crossed him, just before he could pull the same stunt on them. But it was time to consign it to experience, to put it behind him and carry on with his quest. Because his quest was far more important than grasping at tiny morsels of conquest. His quest now was quite literally a matter of life and death. Slowly, tentatively, he reached into himself, seeking out the almost depleted pockets of energy that still remained, looking for the burning embers of their source of trachon that still smoldered within his adopted body, its waning glory only slightly bolstered by the numismatin gas of late lamented Sam. But it just wasn't enough for him. Since stealing both the source of trachon and the body of one of that benighted world's inhabitants, the Master was no longer the desiccated husk of hatred and revenge that he had been. Whereas his current injuries would once have forced a regeneration, now he simply bathed himself in the unutterable goodness of trachon, corrupting that purity to his own ends. Part of him still missed the Time Lord heritage he had mortgaged for this new form of immortality, but that was sentiment, and the Master had no time for such callow, weak emotions. However, despite the added support of the numismatin gas, the source of trachon burnt dimly now, and his overriding concern was to find a replacement before his body, his soul, his very existence simply crumbled into nothing, so much ephemeral dust to be blown away by the time winds. Mentally fanning the source's embers, he began to effect repairs to his burnt and broken body, eking out the remaining energy down nerves and sinews, repairing flesh and bone. Unlike the wild explosion of a regeneration, this was more calculated, more painful, but more controlled. None of the wastefulness of a regeneration, where even the healthy tissue was sacrificed in favor of the new matrix that the limbic bland and forced, a genetic coding decreed by his Time Lord physiognomy. With his powers, he could mold his new body, choose his physical form. The impact that rocked the TARDIS knocked him from both his regenesis and his chair, at the same time throwing him onto the polished black floor and halting the physiological repair. His body crying out in pain, the Master dragged himself upright, trying to reach the console to ascertain what was going on, to try to control it. He didn't make it. The next jolt hurled him against a black, round-eled wall. He managed to fall forward and grab the edge of the console, biting back the scream that rose within him as his burnt flesh cracked and wept with the effort. But there was no time for pain. Locking it away, his eyes scanned the readouts, and he looked in disbelief at what they were telling him. His TARDIS was under attack. But how was that possible? Those bumbling crystalline fools may have been able to injure him, but their asinine dynatropes certainly didn't have access to the sort of technology that was currently shaking his TARDIS to pieces. To effect a TARDIS in flight demanded time technology of the highest order, and there were mercifully few races in the cosmos who could wield such powers. Mercifully few rivals, that was. The Time Lords, certainly, but this brazen attack wasn't their way at all. No, they hid behind agents, lies and half-truths. Direct action was anathema to them. And besides, hadn't the new High Council been only too happy to see the back of him once he had been released from their limbo atrophy in the Matrix? The Daleks. Razalon alone knew they had every reason to want him dead, but he hadn't felt their evil lurking on the sidelines, and, despite everything, he still trusted his instincts. The Cybermen. The Sontarans. He shook his head. Those pathetic races with their stolen, half-hearted time technology. Bastardized TARDISes and feeble osmic projectors. So who was it? He examined the readings more closely and froze. He'd been looking in totally the wrong direction. It was a mistake he knew he was going to regret. The energies which were now beginning to tear his TARDIS apart weren't coming from the planet he had just left. They weren't even coming from the time vortex. They were coming from the deepest levels of reality, from the primal substrate that underpinned the universe. And that could only mean one thing. The Master gulped back his fear. He boosted power to the defenses surrounding his ship with a nigh impenetrable force field, one stolen from a far quasi-time cruiser in the 300th segment of time, and far more resilient than a TARDIS's standard defenses. There, that should do it. He stepped back as the console room filled with the reassuring burbling and twinkling of the energy barrier, as it enwarmed his TARDIS and protected it. There, safe now. The Master fell backwards, only managing to roll and protect himself at the very last second, as a gout of flame erupted from the console. The time rotors' movements became unsteady and labored, and the regular hum of the TARDIS became uneven and raspy. That last hit had penetrated a far quasi-shield. Impossible. Even a head-on assault from a Dalek time fleet couldn't dent that. As he got to his feet and staggered back to the console, a horrible theory was taking shape. Whoever was wielding this magnitude of temporal energies wasn't using technology. There was something natural behind this. It was more like being swatted by some unimaginable power. Oh no. He didn't have to wait long for the confirmation. The word burnt in his mind like fire in the abyss. Kronos. His suspicions had been correct. Panic began to grip his heart, as flies to wanton boys. The Time Lords saw themselves as gods, but there were greater ones than them, gods who could treat them and their vaunted technology as nothing more than irritations to be swatted. Not the Guardians, to preserve the structure of reality. Their hand could never be detected. But there were others. Beings that inhabited the deepest, darkest depths of the vortex. And once, a very long time ago, the Master had enslaved one of them, bent it to his will. Kronos, greatest of the Chronovores. Even as the words lanced into his mind, the Master knew he was no longer alone. The dark shadows of his TARDIS were burning with preternatural fire, flames which coalesced into a figure that was almost too bright to look at. Like some vicious firebird, it hovered over him, its radiance banishing the TARDIS's permanent gloom. Hear me, Lord of Time. The words both hung in the air and burnt into the Master's mind. We are a vengeful people. Our reach is infinite and our patience is eternal. For your actions, we will have vengeance. And the vengeance of the Chronovores is terror beyond imagining. The visitation ended, the Firebird exhausting itself, the console room darkening into shadows once more. But they were no longer the safe and friendly shadows that the Master welcomed. They were compromised, tainted, corrupted. With difficulty the Master began to compose himself, but his tormentor had one more surprise. Before the Master could do anything, his TARDIS was hit by a force so great that it even made the cloister bell chime, warning of the imminent destruction of his ship. Hanging on to the console with his charred weeping fingers, the Master could only wait as his TARDIS was flung across eternity, a hurtling blur through the vortex, its outer surface pixelating as the stresses overwhelmed the chameleon circuit. And within, for the first time in centuries, the Master was scared, terrified. Against the power of a vengeful god, what could a simple Time Lord do? The piecemeal construction of small gods. Chapter 1. Total Eclipse of the Heart. It took a long time before Mel could even begin to calm down. And an even longer time to work out how she was going to approach the Doctor. A long time. It wasn't going to be easy, she decided. Feeling a measure of peace, she sat down on the peach duvet that covered her bed and sighed, releasing the last of the tension, or rather, enough for her to carry on with what she had to do. As she sighed, she examined her reflection in the full-length mirror that rested against the round-eled wall, feeling hideously overdressed in the sequined organza ball gown she had worn for the governor's ill-fated banquet. Had the horror and carnage she had experienced taken their toll on her? She looked exactly the same, 5'1", slim, well-proportioned with a shock of curly red ringlets, just as she had done when she had first stowed away on their TARDIS, all those years ago. Healthy living and a clear conscience. Wasn't that the reason she had once given as to why she hadn't aged much? She looked into her own eyes, and immediately made herself a liar. There was a darkness there, an emptiness. Just the beginnings, but the beginnings of a descent she simply couldn't let happen to her. Mel knew what she had to do, even though it was one of the most difficult decisions she had ever had to make. But she didn't have a choice, not if she valued her own peace of mind. No, more than that, her own sanity. Taking the deep breath, she got off her bed, opened the door and strode purposefully down the empty white corridor towards the console room. The Doctor didn't appear to have moved since she had last seen him. He was still standing over the console, his broken spirit betrayed by his slumped posture. Mel knew that what she was about to say would only make matters worse, but it had to be done. There were some things that just simply couldn't be left unsaid. She had once entertained the notion that the Doctor was nothing more than an extraterrestrial little boy with good intentions, his mood swings, his violent temper, his overgrown ego, nothing more than manifestations of his underdeveloped psyche. The worlds and times they had visited had simply been the Doctor's playpen. It was an easy mistake to make. Little boys didn't make mistakes which cost billions of lives. Little boys didn't commit acts of mass murder by mistake. Little boys didn't hold the fate of their universe in their hands. Doctor, she whispered. Her stomach churned with conflicting emotions, anger, fear, regret. But there was no going back. Not now. Not after Maradnia's He slowly turned his head towards her, and she was horrified to see their transformation. His eyes were hollow, sunken and haunted, his once fruity expression was cold, lifeless. Mel's earlier words had obviously sunk in, but she had made her mind up. No displays of grief were going to sway her from her decision. Mel, She shook her head, warding off his apologies and explanations. She had heard them all before, and they would only make what she had to do even harder. She put her hands up, almost as if that would deflect the doctor's pleas. Set the coordinates for Earth, Doctor. Earth? Why Earth? The faintest flicker of his usual joie de vivre crossed his face, the briefest of colors in the monochrome of his despair. Mel, there's an entire universe out there, he protested, throwing his arms open wide. A veritable atlas of wonders, just waiting for us to visit. What about there? Halls of Mount Atonus, where the air is like nectar and the food is prepared by the gods themselves. Or the rainbow pillars of Hercules on the rim of twilight, overlooking the very edge of reality. His desperation was embarrassingly obvious, but Mel couldn't allow herself to buckle under it. It was far too late for that. Earth, Doctor, she repeated instantly. In response, the doctor's expression was crestfallen. The little boy had had his sweets taken away from him. For a moment, her resolve faltered. Please. He frowned. Are you trying to tell me something? At last. I've had enough, Doctor. More than enough. He moved towards her, his hands unsure whether to move from his sides to comfort her, to reassure her. If you mean Maradnias. His hands stayed at his sides. She gave a pained smile and kept her distance. It's more than just Maradnias. She cast her hands around the multidimensional interior of the TARDIS, part of her realizing that she would never see it again. But nor would it remind her of the pain her travels had caused her. I'm a middle-class girl from Pease Pottage, Doctor. I'm not meant to be traveling around the galaxy and going on day trips to the Big Bang. But Mel, implored the doctor. Her expression gave him no respite. He trailed off, his face falling by the second. Mel leant against one of the round-eled walls and sighed. When I was at university, I had every intention of becoming a computer programmer with one of the big multinationals. You know that. Of course he did, he'd been there, she remembered. But it didn't work out that way. And then you blundered into my life. That business with Shane Annette happened, and then all of this. She held her hands out towards him, almost in supplication. I'm not cut out for this sort of life, Doctor. His puzzled expression made it clear she wasn't getting through to him. Couldn't he see that some people just weren't supposed to be time travelers? I need to get my life in some sort of an order. I want to go home. The little boy was holding back his tears. You're leaving me. At last. I have to, Doctor. She yelled, more forcefully than she would have liked. I can't cope with this anymore. Then, more softly. I just want to go home. Home, he repeated, a strange twist of emotion in his voice. I had one of those. Once, a long time ago. And then the emotion drained away as his hands darted over the console, as if he were playing some complex musical instrument. Pease Pottage, 1986. He asked coldly. That is your home, isn't it? Bitter, Doctor, very bitter, she thought. But she was forced to admit that he was right. Now that she had forsaken the TARDIS, Pease Pottage was her home. had been her home, Mel reminded herself. Now she had to think about where she was going to go, but Pease Pottage wasn't at the top of the list. What was left there for her anymore? Especially after what she'd been through. Because she wasn't the innocent little computer programmer who had stowed aboard their TARDIS. She had seen civilizations rise and fall, exotic life forms from across the galaxy. Horror beyond imagining. She had seen things that no normal person could have seen without going mad. She hadn't gone mad. Not yet. But she needed to get away, needed normality, before she did lose it. But what counted for normal nowadays? Then it came to her. A vivid, photographic memory of a recent visit to Earth at the very end of the 20th century, or reunion. Mel suddenly realized that she knew the whereabouts, and whenabouts, of many of her old university colleagues. And, having already visited Earth in 1999, she knew enough about the web of time to know that it made sense for her to settle down there some time after that. Rejoin main carriageway, as it were. Her mind made up, she gazed into the forlorn face of her erstwhile mentor. "No, Doctor," she said sadly, the emptiness in his eyes seriously attacking her certainty. "Put me down just after we were last there. Near their university. There are a few friends I saw again at that reunion that I can get in touch with." Single quote. The Doctor began to protest, but obviously thought better of it. "If I remember the geography correctly, that's somewhere in West London, isn't it? Isleworth." Single quote. He managed to make the innocuous suburb sound like the deepest pits of hell. Perhaps it was, but it was better than the hell that she would feel staying here in the TARDIS. Mel nodded. "I'll wait in my room until we land. I need to collect my thoughts and my things." The Doctor raised an eyebrow. "Whatever," he muttered, before turning his back on her and fussing with the console. Realizing that there was nothing more to say, Mel walked out of the console room, knowing that collecting her thoughts was impossible. The best she could do was put them into some sort of order. She strode purposefully down their corridor, cataloging her feelings. She wanted to leave the Doctor. She wanted a home that didn't meander through time and space and perpetually land in their middle of trouble. Above all, she wanted absolution from the horror she had seen on Maradnias. But who did she still know well enough to stay with 20 years out of time? Mel's mind raced as she tried to remember her old friends, with all their plans and their dreams at that reunion at the end of 1999. It wasn't that much of a problem for a girl with an IQ of 162 and a photographic memory. The candidates assembled themselves in Mel's mind like a list of missing persons on Crime Watch. Some she remembered from the reunion, some she retrieved from her oh-so-accurate memory as she followed the tracks. But they were all equally vivid. Julia Prince had told her that she was about to go on a 4-year placement to the university's twin seat in Italy as part of her job at West London, although Mel just didn't want to think about what Rome would make of her clothes sense. And Leonore Pridge had been flying out to Rio to begin a modeling contract. Well, with the best will in the world, even if Leonore and her cosmetic surgery had been in the country, she would hardly provide the stability that Mel craved. Too flighty. Then there was the stunning Chantal Edwards, all blonde hair and designer labels. An obvious choice, she thought wryly. Mel dismissed the flirty, overdressed Chantal out of hand. She needed an anchor, and Chantal was about as anchored as a feather cushion in a hurricane. The faces continued to roll past in her mind: Wesley, Teresa, Fran, Toby, Vicky, Carl. Of course. During Mel's last year at West London University, she had shared a room in halls with someone who fulfilled all her the requirements. Level-headed, caring, understanding Angelica Whitefriar. With the recollection of the name, all the attendant memories came tumbling down like dominoes. For a second, vivid nostalgia overwhelmed Mel as she remembered the good old days at university, the dinner parties, on the cheap, of course, with Angelica and their best friends Paul and Arlene, as the four of them sorted out the world, putting it to rights as only they knew how. If Mel had known that she would eventually have been responsible for sorting out their galaxy. Imagine the after-dinner conversations they would have had then. Mel realized that she was now at the door to her room. It was a door like every door in this mad, lovable place that she had called home, white and roundelled. But she knew it was hers and hers alone, knew this from the familiarity she had shared with the TARDIS from day one, a presence that sat within her mind like an old friend. A friend she was abandoning, a familiarity that she knew had to come to a sad, final end. She swallowed, pushing open that door, forcing herself to accept that this was the last time she would see this room, see the knickknacks and paraphernalia she had accumulated over the years. Closing the door behind her, she leant against its cool white surface and took a deep breath before stepping into what had once been hers. Trying to ignore the knot that was tightening in her stomach, she picked up their red cone of a party hat from the dressing table, a celebration of the 31st of December, 1999, and all that had happened on that fateful day. Then there was the rugged sphere anointed with cones, a disconnected quark processor unit from their terrifying run-in with the quarks and the giant wasps. The holoempathlic image of Troy, his cheerful bearded face and effervescent personality resonating in her mind, and the scintillating green trapezium of a Dalek logic crystal sitting next to her makeup. Wonderful memories, true, but she didn't need holoempathic images and quark heads. And she definitely didn't need Dalek logic crystals. She had those memories, and she had her memory. And that was where all this bric-a-brac was going to be consigned. She did remember, she would remember, and that was all that was important. This was her past. It most certainly wasn't her future. Mel just knew that she didn't want to become like the Doctor, a time-traveling jackdaw with a magic box full of the past. She wanted to start living her life again, being herself. Finding out what Melanie Bush would have been if she hadn't hooked up with the Doctor and his meanderings. Renewing her determination, she grabbed her holdall from the top of their wardrobe and started to pack. Packing for her future. The Master forced his eyes open, trying to ignore the pain as the blistered flesh tore, leaking bitter tears down his scarred face. Being knocked unconscious by the temporal acceleration hadn't given him the chance to immerse himself fully in the healing pool of the source of Traken, and now the fleeting initial effects had worn off. With all that entailed. Once again, he was forced to deal with the familiar side effect, the acceleration of his decay and devolution, his inevitable, final end. Within his ink-black suit staggered the withered, emaciated creature that was all that remained of his time. Lord Body, Tremas's form long rotted and gone. His life now. The humans that the Doctor loved, those same humans that their Master adored for their malleability, believed in hell, in Satan. Indeed, it was a belief that the Master had turned to his own advantage on more than one occasion. The Time Lords had different gods and very different devils, and a very different hell. But were they so different in the end? Indeed, was the Master so evil that even hell would reject him? No. It was nothing to do with good and evil. Only power, his power. Dismissing his fears, he pulled himself to his feet. His festering eyes, set within the ravages of a once handsome Time Lord face, peering through the murk of his console room at the glittering readouts from his console. Even through those ravaged eyes he could tell where he was. Despite everything, his symbiotic link with the TARDIS was still working. The Rassilon imprimatur was his birthright. Even the Time Lords couldn't take that from him. He knew with an absolute certainty that his TARDIS was adrift, lying powerless on the blue shift, the very edge of the universe. The end of everything. Beyond this point, the laws of physics were being written by another hand. Exotic particles responded to bastard forces under an utterly alien set of rules. No place for a TARDIS. Or its ravaged master. Or was it? Exotic particles. With painful steps, he reached the console and began to plan his escape. And his own revenge. Mel checked that she looked okay for 21st century Earth. Cream slacks, white shoes, a white blouse and a dark blue jumper, the arms tied around her neck. Perfect. She gave her room one last look before she picked up her holdall, leaving the quark head and the Dalek logic crystal behind. In the TARDIS, where they belonged. The holoempathlic image. Well, she might have a photographic memory, but there were times when she forgot to put the film in. The perfect representation of Troy's face fell into the holdall, cushioned by Mel's favorite jumper. Now she had everything she needed to start her new life. Apart from, Mel couldn't help but pick up the stuffed owl. A present from someone who would understand. Understand that it was time to leave. She touched the cool white wall and said goodbye. And, deep within her mind, she heard a voice. Rich, fruity. Not unlike the Doctor's. Goodbye, Melanie Bush. Like the others, you too will be missed. Holding back the tears, Mel closed the door for the last time, and tried to look forward. Forget the TARDIS, forget the Doctor, forget traveling through time and space. It was time to put down roots. She smiled as she thought of Angelica. Perhaps they could celebrate her return with a dinner party. Yes, that was it, a dinner party. And they could invite Paul and Arlene. Ah yes. Arlene, calmly putting down Paul's often outrageous behavior with nothing more than a shrug and a pointed look at the ceiling. There was very little that could faze Arlene Cole. You bastard! Yelled Arlene, looking up from the insect monitor, her dark face contorted in anger. After all the work I put into this alignment, you've recalibrated the array. She stood up, knocking her chair over with the reverberating clang. Why the hell did I bother? Paul, who had been sauntering through the white and chrome expanse of their Titan array with a cup of instant cappuccino from the coffee machine in their anteroom, stopped in his tracks. This tall, elegant black woman, still attractive, even in her lab coat, was many things: his research partner, his best friend, his fiancée, but in this mood she was his worst enemy. And saying nothing was the best defense in this situation. Mainly because he knew he was in the wrong. Arlene was standing in front of him within seconds, her face inches away from his. Paul could smell the coffee on her breath, her trademark perfume. But there look of loathing in her eyes was almost enough to make him recoil. "I haven't slept for 4 days, Paul," she shouted. "4 days? What do you think I've been doing every night while you've been away at that symposium? Washing my hair." She turned her back on him and threw her hands in the air. "That was the most complex set of penetration criteria we've ever attempted. And for what? It's all ruined." "I can change them back," said Paul. But he knew this was a lame reply. Calculating the penetration criteria wasn't simply a question of maths and physics. Paul, Arlene and their mentor, Stuart, had to invent entirely new methods of scientific inquiry for the Titan array. Criteria which were correct now, at this precise moment in time, wouldn't be correct a second time. The uncertainty principle, Planck's constant and a whole host of other esoteric factors meant that each attempt to explore the fundamental nature of reality was a one-off. With Titan, the microscopic factors which dictated the fine stitching of the fabric of reality were magnified into the macroscopic world. It wasn't like programming a computer, nothing so mundane. It was like playing a musical instrument, a Stradivarius or a Steinway. No two performances were exactly the same. And Arlene's one-off performance had been well and truly screwed up to this time. "I'm sorry," he stuttered. "I thought. Arlene started to laugh. "For someone who's supposed to be one of the most intelligent men on this planet, you show a frightening lack of common sense." Shaking her head, she stormed out of the array heading for the anteroom. Paul couldn't follow her, because he had to admit that she was right. When he had got back from the physics symposium in Copenhagen, a day early, due to the fact that there was nothing being discussed that was of any interest to him whatsoever, and b. he had spent most of the week attempting to avoid that old fraud Winterdawn hurling himself around the Copenhagen conference center in his souped-up wheelchair. He hadn't gone to the flat. Instead, he had come straight to the university, to the Titan array, hoping to see Arlene, to surprise her. But she was nowhere to be seen, and from what she had just told him, he guessed she had been taking a rest after her epic stint at their array. If only he had gone to the flat. Standing in the center of the marble cathedral of the array, he had looked around bored, only to see that the master console was still live. He hadn't meant to change anything. He'd only wanted to see what Arlene had been doing. He had just taken a quick look at the penetration parameters for this evening's Titan run, the one scheduled for 8 p.m. But then he hadn't liked what he'd seen. There was something just not quite right about the wave envelope. Call it intuition, call it a gift, but Paul could feel the equations in his mind, feel their shapes, their rhythms. He could feel how they interacted with the basic fabric of reality. The whole purpose of the Titan array, and the penetration surface that Arlene's criteria defined, just didn't feel as if it would work. The right equation set was like a key fitting in a lock, and Paul knew that Arlene's key simply wouldn't unlock Calabi space, their ultimate goal. And so he had sat down at the master console, and started to tinker. The Planck length compensation factor didn't tally with the Kikuawa Yamasaki models that he and Arlene had constructed, so he adjusted it. The Kaluza-Klein variance seemed too high, so he reduced it to more manageable levels. For nearly an hour Paul had tweaked and refined his fiancée's equation set until he was happy, until it felt right. And then he had got himself a coffee. But Arlene wasn't his assistant. She was his partner, in all the ways that she possibly could be, that anyone could be. What had he been thinking, just discarding all her work like that? It was unprofessional, it was rude, it was downright insulting. But Paul was professor of temporal physics at the University of West London, and one of the most respected physicists in the world. There wasn't anyone on the planet who could do what he could, who knew what he knew. Staring at the cold froth of his coffee, Paul thought of his dear friend Aaron Blinovich, but that young Russian bear's theories were closer to witchcraft than science, especially where his downright nonsensical limitation effect was concerned. Even the Whittaker archives, released by the government after 30 years, showed nothing to back up the rumors that Whittaker had created a working time machine. As for the Newton Institute at Wootton in the 70s, well, Emeritus Professor Stuart Hyde wasn't giving anything away. Paul had spent enough money on getting the old man drunk on cider and whiskies and orange to prove it. And as for Winterdawn's attempts, well, Paul wasn't going to give him any credit. The man was an intellectual thief with the integrity of an earwig. So, at the end of the day, Paul Kairos was unique. Unique because he was the man who was going to give the world the universe. But he wasn't going to do it on his own. He couldn't do that to Arlene. He owed her too much. She deserved her chance on the array, whether he thought she was wrong or not. He checked his watch at 6:45 p.m. They had been planning another run at 8 p.m. and both the generator time and access to the grid had been booked from 7:30. Paul pursed his lips. It would a shame to waste it all. He knew he had time to recreate her parameters. That was simply a question of physics and mathematics. All he had to do was revoke Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, tell Max Planck he was mistaken, and tear up every physics textbook in the university library. It was the least that he could do for Arlene. Paul sat down at the master console and started to recreate Arlene's settings. Perfectly. Flawlessly. Like a concert pianist. A chime from the console indicated that the TARDIS had landed, but the Doctor didn't even make the effort to look round at her or communicate the information. He simply stared at the monitors and readouts, silent, impassive. Standing in the doorway to the console room, her holder in her hands, Mel didn't know what to think. It was the end of an era, despite the fact that she knew that she couldn't stay. Leaving him felt terrible. It felt like desertion. What if the Doctor needed her? What if her departure would lead to even worse things? But Mel wasn't equipped to answer those questions. She was a simple human being, and she needed a simple life. She just couldn't stay. She broke the sepulchral silence of the console room. I take it we landed okay. No response. Right, if you wanted it that way. I'll be off then, she added flatly. The Doctor remained silent. His only response was to pull up the red lever that allowed the great doors to open. Mel lifted up the holdall and made for them. Before she could get there, the Doctor looked up at her, and the depth of sorrow etched into his face, and the darkness of his eyes, made her momentarily reconsider her decision. This wasn't a Time Lord. This was that lost little boy, desperate for someone to chase the monsters away. He handed her a small blue velvet pouch. Here. You might need this. His voice was cracked and broke her without thinking. She took the pouch and threw it into the holdall. No. If you don't leave now, you'll never leave. Tearing her gaze from their pathetic figure clutching the console, she strode through the open doors, through the darkness of the dimensional interface into the warm summer night. It's over. Mel gave a final glance back at the TARDIS settled incongruously in the drive of a house in Osterley, the rich suburb within a suburb of Isleworth. What would the Doctor do now, she wondered. Would he simply pick up another willing victim like her, or would he learn the error of his ways? But it was no longer her problem, was it? Turning away from the reassuring blue shape of her former home, Melanie looked around for the turning she needed to take to find Angelique's flat. Hoping that it still was Angelique's flat, it had been 13 years since Mel had known for certain that her old friend lived there. She determined the route and set off, and froze, dropping the holdall onto the pavement. From behind her the raucous groaning briefly echoed around the cul-de-sac, drowning out the traffic noise from the A4. Mel spun round, just in time to see the faded blue outline of the TARDIS finally evaporate, its roof like the last thing to dissolve into the August twilight. Somehow, deep down, she hadn't expected him to leave. The weight of realization finally hit her. She was alone, at least 13 years after she had left, with the Doctor, with no idea what to do. For a second, it threatened to overwhelm her. But she had made her decision. She was home, firmly rooted in terra firma. She was in London, on Earth, not fighting monsters on the edge of time and space. She was home. So why did it feel so dreadful? Ignoring her heavy heart, Mel picked up the holdall and set off for Angelique's flat, deliberately ignoring the golden retriever that barks at her. At 7:30 p.m., Arlene stubbed out her cigarette, left the restroom and headed towards the Titan Array. As she walked down the deserted corridors of their Chapel Institute of the University of West London, much of her anger had subsided. But she wasn't going to let Paul get away with it. She knew that, intellectually, he was superior to her. In terms of his knowledge of temporal physics, he was superior to everyone. But that was accepted between them, it was how their relationship worked. Paul's broad-brush approach had achieved much. The Titan Array was simply the latest in a series of successes that had given him a shelf full of scientific awards, including the Nobel Prize before he had hit 25, but his attention to detail left a lot to be desired. That was where Arlene's skills came in. She dotted the I's, crossed the T's and joined the dots after Paul's butterfly imagination had fluttered off to pastures more interesting. It was a methodology that worked for both of them, until those, admittedly rare, occasions when Paul did something as bloody-minded as this. 4 nights of coffee, Pro Plus and cigarettes, all for nothing. She'd even given up rehearsing with her band for a fortnight. How was that for dedication? Only to see Paul throw it all in the bin. Reaching the secure entrance to the Titan Array, Arlene held her smart card to the sensor, waited for the click, then pulled the heavy white door open and stopped. Paul was hunched over the master console, but that was nothing unusual. Titan was his baby, and he cared for it almost as much as he cared for Arlene, if not more, she ruefully admitted. What was strange was the noise. The fact that there was any. Normally, the Titan Array was completely silent. Subatomic particles and fundamental forces aren't exactly known for being rowdy. But during the build-up to a test run, Titan drew on the entire output of the Chapel Institute's generators. And the capability to power all of London 3 times overcomes it. A price, a throbbing hum that you feel in your bones. Like now. The marble walls and floor, the 50-foot high chrome lattice of their array, all of it was vibrating at its resonant frequency, as was Arlene. And that could only mean one thing. Despite everything that had happened between them, Paul was going ahead with another run. And after their previous argument, this was nothing less than a slap in the face. She hurried over to the master console, her Doc Marten boots clumping on the thrumming marble floor. "Now look here, mister." Arlene put her hand on Paul's shoulder, none too delicately, and pulled him round in his chair, enjoying the scared bemusement on his chubby, goatee-bearded face. He deserved it. "What do you think? You're..." She trailed off as she caught sight of the main monitor in front of him. One of the Q Solaris windows was showing the wave envelope that would be used in tonight's run. Her wave envelope? I don't understand. Paul shrugged her off, stood up and grasped her shoulders in turn. "We're going with your parameters. I recreated them." "But that's not possible," she whispered. Her parameters, however important they were to her, were nothing more than a set of coaxing guidelines, polite attempts to persuade the universe to behave the way she and Paul wanted it to. Once the waveforms and equations were created within their artificial intelligence at the heart of the Titan array, that was it. They could never be used again. The uncertainty principle, all-powerful at the quantum level, was writ large within the array. It mattered at macroscopic level. Arlene had configured the array with her parameters, and Paul had changed them. End of story. As far as Arlene knew, there was no possible way that he could have recreated them without changing the laws of physics. But he had recreated them for her. Taking a deep breath, Arlene gave a nervous smile. "I'm not even going to ask." Sometimes that was the best way with Paul. For all she knew, he had just discovered some little-known corollary to Heisenberg and was now putting it to the test. Paul grinned. "I think that's very wise. Shall we start? We've got full generator access, and we have 820 petahertz processing power from the grid for the next 5 hours. With that, he sat at the master console and indicated for Arlene to take the other chair, as if he'd done nothing more complex than make a cup of tea. Arlene shrugged. She'd got used to the idea of Paul as a genius years ago. Now, it looked like she was going to have to accept that he had godlike powers. All in a day's work, she decided, as she started checking the readouts. But she still couldn't help but be puzzled. Never had the sound of the TARDIS dematerializing sounded so harsh, so accusatory, the Doctor decided as his vessel entered the time vortex. But what could he have done? Run out of the TARDIS and begged her to come back? Got down on bended knee and promised to mend his ways? No, not the way that Mel felt. He pressed the pause control, leaving the TARDIS hovering in the portion of the vortex adjacent to Earth. It wasn't necessary to he, a mind reader, to sense the depth of her feelings, of her hurt. The Doctor groaned. There were times when he had been exactly that. But now, it was as if other people's feelings were invisible to him, other people's souls impervious. A bitter smile. Once, Mel had protested at how unfair it all was. But, as always, the Doctor had had an answer: the universe rarely is. That's why I'm here. Single quote. Not anymore. He just couldn't be here anymore. So, where now? Another period in Earth's history. Or another planet, one which would be a surprise to him. He shook his head. How could he do anything without the constant fear of making a mistake, or doing to another world what he had done to Moradnias. Another memory, this time Perry. I used to think that you were different. That you cared for justice, truth and good. How much justice, truth and good lay in the radioactive wastes of Moradnias. Overriding guilt and confusion were freezing him into an action, abrasive emotions that were completely alien to him. The Doctor wanted silence, he just wanted to he on his own. But not in the TARDIS, not where every roundel would remind him of his failure, of his complicity in genocide. Even the cloister room was too steeped in memory. How could he be on his own within there? Transcendental interior of his oldest friend, its mind constantly reaching out to him. He didn't want the TARDIS's pity. No, it was a time for solitary reflection, and a time for him to start to understand his place in the universe. That nagging call of solitude had been with him since his last regeneration, begging him to consider how a single Time Lord could make a difference to the cold, unfeeling cosmos out there. Begging him to understand the sacrifices he would need to make to champion his cause. Champion. Frowning, he considered those worlds which could offer him their luxury of reflection, and began to tap out staccato requests to the TARDIS database. The image of the turbulent vortex on the scanner screen vanished to be replaced by a scene of utter tranquility, simple wooden huts on a rolling plain of emerald grass. Tall pale figures strolled between the huts, dressed in basic beige robes, their heads bowed in contemplation. It was Darren, where he had spent decades during the latter part of his second incarnation learning their psychic techniques of the mind monks, the most serene people in the cosmos. So how could he contaminate their purity with the blood that stained his soul? Another tap 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 on the console, and the picture now showed the desolate hermitage of Titan III, a barren expanse of rocks and boulders. It was possibly their most remote planet in the galaxy, so far below the plane of the ecliptic that no one ever came closer than 100,000 light-years. No visitors, usually. No stray thoughts, nothing. The ultimate retreat. No, too lonely. Amidst that particular solitude, the Doctor knew that he would go insane. And an insane Doctor hardly bore thinking about. He refused to go there, both mentally and physically. A wave of nostalgia overcame him as the picture changed once more. Unobtrusive lamps mounted on the carpeted walls showed off sheer opulence to its best advantage. The whole place glittered, and everything that didn't glitter simply glowed. Tempus Fugit, the greatest restaurant on Pallas Saturnus, ice world of the Wrath, and the Doctor's home for 5 years. But what would PFIFL and Lacalis say if they knew of the blood on his hands? Their adopted son a mass murderer? No, there was one other sanctuary. Tap tap tap. The soaring towers and minarets of Gallifrey itself, the lesser towers of their capital popping around the emerald dominance of the Panopticon, all sealed beneath an impenetrable dome, the grand isolation of the Time Lord homeworld. It was somewhere the Doctor had turned his back on centuries ago. And every successive return had been a nightmare. Yet deep below the Junior Senate block lay the famed polygonal Zero Room. Built in Time Lord prehistory by the Other himself, it would give him the rest cure that he craved. Cut off from external distractions, yet enwhelmed by the Time Lord intelligentsia, it would be the perfect place to recuperate, to leave the cold, hard cosmos behind. Hard facts hit him like a bucket of cold water. How could he return home? How could he face the disapproval and accusation of his peers after the events on Moradnias? He had narrowly escaped being found guilty of genocide during that kangaroo court on the CIA space station, and on that occasion he had been innocent. But this time, his guilt was clear. The blood was still wet. And in that moment of self-doubt his thoughts quickly strayed from their courtroom to the dark figure of the learned court prosecutor. The Valeyard. The man, no, the creature, that had been appointed by a corrupt high council to try him for his supposed crimes had been a doctor. But a doctor from the doctor's own future, the distillation of all that festered inside his soul across all his incarnations poured into one foul vessel. The fear of becoming that had hovered over the doctor's life like some black mocking raven ever since he had left the space station so very many years ago. He had done everything to avoid that future from coming to pass, but to no avail. He had tried to keep away from Earth, from Mel, only to find himself there, and to be tricked into taking her on board the TARDIS. He had tried to avoid their region of space and time that contained the Hyperion 3, only to respond instinctively to the Commodore's distress call and deliberately commit genocide by destroying the Vervoids. And now, he had destroyed Maradnias. Was his descent into the Valeyard inevitable? Was that haughty, mocking, arrogant being his ultimate destiny? He remembered a line from his defense, and you took it upon yourselves to act like second-rate gods. So what had he done on Maradnias? He had interfered. He had committed genocide once again, all the charges that the Valeyard had thrown at him. He was guilty, and no court, even the august reverence of the High Tribunal, would think otherwise. So how could he return to Gallifrey now? An urgent bleep from the console brought to him gratefully back to the present. Something untoward was happening, and his frown deepened as he read their graphs and figures on the monitors. According to the three traces, the Earth was virtually on fire with temporal energies. So, nothing new there, then. Noting the date 2003, the Doctor was able to disregard two of the traces. One was dear old Blinovich, or dear young Blinovich, depending on how his unstable timeline was doing. Still pottering around in St. Petersburg with his theories and Heath Robinson equipment, while the other was undoubtedly that oleaginous leaf-av with his purloined theories and stolen equipment, destined to come to a very sticky end. The other one was very familiar as well, yet from where? It wasn't a TARDIS, that was certain. Although the Earth was a honeypot for his fellow renegades, the planet was currently clear of any of their trademark Artran energy traces. But this one was familiar. The Doctor slammed the console in anger as he finally recognized it. Visiting Time Lords were one thing, but this was something quite different. The other reading was not of Time Lord origin. It wasn't even of extraterrestrial origin. It had been developed on Earth, and that made it the Doctor's business setting the coordinates for the time trace. He groaned when he saw the location, which simply served to confirm his suspicions. But he had no choice, because if what he was seeing was what he thought it was, none of them had much time, in the worst possible sense of their word. Beyond the dark side of the moon, the Master's TARDIS, disguised as a cloud of ionized vapor and shielded from detection by technology that would have staggered the Time Lords even at the pinnacle of their scientific prowess, drifted in the void. Within its darkly transcendental interior, the Master pored over the console, ensuring for one final time that everything was perfect. In relative terms, it had been months since his encounter with the Chronovores, months in which he had painstakingly prepared his defense, his revenge, and his rebirth. At the edge of creation, he had gathered the exotic materials he would need, transforming his TARDIS into a ramp scoop for the purpose, and, while there, TARDIS had been storing these particles in magnetic bottles next to the dynamorphic generators. He had finally been granted the time to repair their damage to his physical form. But it had been difficult, so very difficult. Despite the boost that had come from the numismaton gas, the source of Traken was now virtually exhausted. The effort needed to rebuild himself had been more than he had ever imagined, draining his strength, his will, his very soul. The Master was well aware that this was the last time he could rely on the source of Traken, which made what he was about to do all the more important. Renewed, for the last time, there had been another clandestine visit to Gallifrey, in and out without those pompous fools ever suspecting a thing. After their grand overreaction to the sleepers from Andromeda, and what a pantomime that had been, the Master had expected at least a token attempt to beef up security, but no, his TARDIS had slid through the quantum and transduction barriers without a care, materializing in its usual spot, deep below the capital, where he had complete access to the Matrix and all its secrets. Stepping out of his TARDIS, which was blatantly undisguised in its default form as a plain white box, he remembered the first time he had plundered his people's secrets. Just beyond the range of the planetary detection system, a localized space-time event curdled the laws of physics for a few moments. Finally, the quantum foam of the continuum stabilized, but space was no longer empty. Suspended in the void, immune to detection, the Master's TARDIS had finally come home to Gallifrey. The Master checked the complex assembly of components attached to various parts of his control console and nodded. Bought, stolen and fought over on the 100 worlds. The end result of this technology would shield him from the inquisitive eyes of his former brethren on Gallifrey. The Osmic Projector, bought from a rogue Suntaran on Veltries 4, the Dardis Core, stolen from Skaro itself. A vortex cloak, discovered in the ruins of the Garbage Cone throne world on their edge of the Great Attractor. All brought together by his genius in temporal engineering, all designed to keep his presence secret. However, getting thus far would not suffice. The Master needed to reach Gallifrey itself. He glanced at the table that stood next to the console. A dull golden circlet sat there, surrounded by discarded tools, the equipment necessary to breach an excitonic network. A quiet bleep issued from the console, informing the Master that the scan of Gallifrey's defenses was complete. The Rutan analysis engine had seen to that. Satisfied, he slammed his fist down on the vortex primer, hurling his TARDIS down the single weak point in Gallifrey's ramparts. According to the Rutan device, there was a weakness, a fracture caused by a chance interference pattern in the 10th dimension between the quantum and the transduction barriers. It was slight, nothing that could be exploited by an attacking enemy, so nothing that could possibly concern the Time Lords, assuming that they even noticed it. Unless that enemy was piloting one of the Time Lords' own TARDISes. Camouflaged by the array of defensive devices, the Master's TARDIS deftly slipped through Gallifrey's defenses, darting through the time vortex until it reached the entry point he had defined. And then, unannounced by the alarms and alerts that usually accompanied unauthorized materializations in the capital, the Master's TARDIS faded into existence, appearing as an ancient pillar gothically cloaked in the dust and decay. that surrounded it, one more ruin amongst many. Picking up the circlet, the Master opened the door and stepped out of his TARDIS. The air was dank and stale, but that wasn't surprising. The Master had materialized about half a kilometer below the foundations of the capital, within the ruins of the first capital that had stood on the site tens of millions of years ago. The whole area had been wiped from the Time Lord's consciousness, the loss of the early building an embarrassment, a reminder that with great power comes great responsibility. But the Master did not adhere to that philosophy. The Time Lord's great power should be used to ensure harmony, to assure complete obedience. With such obedience, the universe would be united as never before. And yet the Time Lords sought only to nurture, to encourage, and lately, to ignore. That wasn't enough for the Master, he knew, with the certainty that comes with the absolute confidence of true superiority, that this bred only weakness. Which was why he was here. To take the Time Lord's knowledge and power and put it to the use for which it was truly intended. Moving purposefully over to a low, grime-covered console, the Master extracted a cloth from his pocket and wiped away the dust of millennia before pulling the small crystal block from his pocket and placing it on the flat surface. The result was immediate. The console lit up, displays flashing, strings of readouts glinting in every color, old High Gallifreyan script and symbolic logic scrolling across the monitors. The Master smiled and stroked his graying goatee beard. After all, this time the console still worked. Wryly, he doubted that the Time Lords, enacting their ancient charades far above him, would have the faintest idea how to operate this machine, let alone build something similar. But activating the console had been the easy part. The difficulty would be in using it, because failure would mean death. His mind incinerated. Failure would leave him a drooling cretin, dribbling and babbling among the cadavers of his people's past. Carefully he placed the circlet over his head, adjusting it so that it sat correctly. Then, taking an involuntary deep breath, he laid his hands on their console's telepathic circuits, one living mind reaching out to a multitude of dead ones, and accessed the matrix. He felt his mind being drawn into the endless, timeless, amplified, panotropic net that comprised the matrix, a bottomless ocean of thoughts and memories. It would be so easy to let go, to allow himself to be immersed in the matrix for ever. But although that would grant his mind immortality, his empty, soulless body would quickly perish. No, the Master knew what he was looking for, and would not allow himself to become distracted. He waited impatiently for the psychic landscape to stabilize around him, eager to seize his prize and get away. Cloaked with cyber-psionic technology that made the excitonic circuitry of their matrix look like an abacus, hidden from the baleful eyes of the Time Lords, the Master got his bearings from his meticulous studies. He was prepared for the fact that the matrix looked different to each Time Lord who entered it. What he wasn't prepared for was what his subconscious had in store for him. It was a necropolis, an impossibly endless horizon of mausoleums and gravestones, of funeral pyres and juggernauts, orbiting death stations and spirit crystal monuments, thanatic memories of 1,000 worlds. It felt like home. Striding through the serried headstones, under the shadows of the death satellites, the Master examined each one in turn. Each monument, each grave, contained a secret. But there was a particular set of secrets that the Master needed, that he craved. Dark knowledge. The circlet on his brow was more than just a copy of the Matrix terminal worn by the Time Lord President. The Master's version should allow him to read and transmit the information to his TARDIS's databanks. And now he was about to put it to the test. He had found the first of his chosen targets. Kneeling by a black marble headstone, he satisfied himself that it would be of value and transferred it to his TARDIS. Then another headstone, and another. The Time Lord's darkest secrets were being plundered from beneath their very noses. Gravestone, funeral pyre, death satellite, each one offering him immeasurable glory. The Master's ecstasy was beyond compare. The doomsday weapon on Uxarius, the psychic parasites of Bellerophon, the frozen gods of Volvox, the Earth's sleeping races, the mechanics of the source of Traken, the location of the Nestine homeworld, the hidden beauty of the Midnight Cathedral, the secret name of the last of the demons. All of it his. All of it. Now intoxicated by the influx of information, the Master didn't hear the alarm the first time its tocsin rang out. Nor the second. The death worms were such a fascinating life form. But the third chime caught his attention. They had found him accessing the last secret, the mysterious crystal of Kronos and its relationship with the Chronovores. The Master quickly inserted the program he had prepared into the Matrix. Then he withdrew his mind and removed the circlet. The program was simple in purpose, but unimaginably complex in design and execution. It would enable the Master to slip through the Time Lord's defenses without having to rewire most of his console. It would permit him to plunder the dark secrets of the Time Lords whenever he wanted, wherever he wanted, amidst the alarms and cacophony that were audible even deep underground. And imagining the chaos above him, the Master stepped back inside his TARDIS. With a final look back at the wasted promise of the Time Lords, he closed their doors. Seconds later, his TARDIS was gone, with nothing to suggest that it had ever been there. That was so many, many years ago. Since then, the Master's mind had returned to the Matrix time and again, using its arcane knowledge to reinforce his power base. Dry facts and desiccated data became knowledge, conquest and dominion. As he strove to rework the universe in his own image, the ice world of Spiridon and its army of Daleks, the political machinations of the Amentethes, the Proculus and their vile offspring, the Sherbalis, the Martian Goat Engine, there for the asking. This time was different. This time, he could no longer rely on his remote access to the Matrix. The secrets he required were buried within its deepest fortresses. Fortresses that required a more direct approach. Which was why he had returned to Gallifrey one more time. The Matrix was a psychic mausoleum, 10 million years of Razalon's destiny entombed within their telepathic lattices of a million dead Time Lords, empowered by the Artron energy of the Primi of Harmony. The sum total of all knowledge, patrolled by their dead. But the Master chose to ignore the ghosts that haunted the cyber-psionic circuitry, the specters that lurked within the Artron pathways. He didn't need their distractions, he knew exactly what he was looking for. In the past, it hadn't been necessary to hurry, he had had all the time in the universe. But on this occasion it was different. The Chronovores were out there, watching, waiting. And he had run out of time. Speeding through the excitonic circuitry, he found his way to the mental crypt he had spotted centuries ago. Then, the knowledge it contained had been esoteric. Useless. Now, it was his lifeline. 13 million years ago, on the planet Kerbili at the edge of the Pegasus Tract. The inhabitants had discovered something important. Not to them. They wiped themselves out a couple of centuries later during a facile argument, having never even put the technology into practice. But the information had been harvested by the Time Lords, transmitted to the Matrix, stored away in their deepest vaults, and subsequently forgotten for millennia. Until now. Using mental incantations and cyber-psionic spells that instantly broke through the encrypted words which protected the data, the Master had seized their information in a moment and carried it back to the infinite repository of his TARDIS. The forgotten knowledge of the Kerbili, and the perfect instrument for his revenge. And now he was 250,000 miles away from the final piece of his jigsaw puzzle, a very large piece called Titan. The piece that would allow him to seize godhood. Stuart Ian Hyde, Emeritus Professor of Physics at West London University, looked around his study and sighed, nothing to show for anything but their accumulated crap of 3 decades. Leather-bound copies of his researches, all pointless. Half-hearted awards for simply not being dead yet. Piles of journals by academics half his age, hammering home everything that he hadn't achieved. Stuart had been hoping to retire soon, but how could he? How could he retire when young Kronos was so close to cracking their secrets that had been revealed to him nearly 30 years ago before they were snatched away? How could he retire before his one last chance to bask in someone else's reflected glory? He picked up the silver-framed photograph on his desk and stared back into his past. It showed him as a bright, hopeful graduate, his mentor Dr. Ruth Ingram at his side, ready to take on the universe. What Stuart hadn't counted on was the universe taking him on. How could he have guessed that the charming Greek professor who had stepped in to take over after Professor Opfer's unfortunate and unexpected death had been anything but a visiting academic from Athens University? How could he have known that Professor Thascales had been not a Greek scientist but a renegade member of an omnipotent time-traveling alien race? At that point, Stuart Hyde's optimism had died. At 25, the age another Greek scientist, Paul Kairos, had been when he won the Nobel Prize, Stuart had realized that whatever he and Ruth achieved, there would be others who got there first. What was the point in striving to find the secrets of the universe when there were creatures out there to whom the deeper mysteries of time were nothing more than bedtime stories for children? His career had progressed, true. After the incident at the Newton Institute in Wotton, his very notoriety had assured him a place on a post-grad course. But it had hardly been the meteoric rise everyone had predicted when he had been a shining star in Cambridge. Instead, Stuart, now only too painfully aware of his oh-so-human limitations, had become a methodical plodder, floating to the academic surface bit by bit as soon as he had accumulated enough academic bubbles to get to him there. But what was the point? It wasn't as though he could discover something that hadn't already been discovered eons ago, was it? Thanks to UNIT and their Official Secrets Act, he was forced into silence while parasites like Winter Dawn were stealing the information from under his very nose with government approval. Thank God he could remember most of the work he and Ruth had done, even if Ruth was now seconded to some stupid project over in Paris with Lefav, and that Paul was carrying it out. Titan was the son of Tom Tit, and Stuart was the stepfather. Whatever that was worth. He sighed as he replaced the photograph, and checked the Ormolu clock on their mantelpiece. It was just after 8, more than enough time to get into town and indulge himself. Dinner at La Belladonna, a bottle or two of Crow's Hermitage. Stuart Hyde pulled himself out of his chair, feeling every second of his 55 years. As he stood up, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and it didn't make him feel any better. His hair was white, and cut short. He had grown a beard, and that was white as well. His eyes, once deep and expressive, were now dark and empty. Thanks to this bout of introspection, that Crow's Hermitage was looking more and more inviting. His reverie was broken when the door to his study was suddenly flung open. He looked round to see a wild-eyed stranger, his expression verging on their maniacal, in the doorway. "You stupid, stupid man." Stuart had never seen him before. He would have remembered a tall, thick-set man with a shock of curly blonde hair, dressed in a Joseph's coat of red and yellow. This was a complete stranger, and Stuart really ought to press the security alert. But something stopped him. Something told him that he had known the man all his adult life. He began to fashion a response, but before he could utter a single word, the stranger let rip. "Didn't that incident with Tomtit teach you any lessons, you microcephalic numbskull?" he yelled, his multicolored jacket trailing behind him like some rainbow cloak. He leant over the desk, shoving his face into Stuart's. "Time isn't some sort of laboratory experiment for you to play about with. The fabric of reality is a delicate thing, man," he spluttered. "It's a chain of circumstance and chance which underlies everything. Your experiments are tantamount to sticking a pin in a balloon, just to see what's inside." He looked different. He sounded different. And yet, Stuart frowned. Could it be? The hairs began to stand up on the back of his neck, as the truth sank in after all these years of dreaming, of praying for the chance to meet another of these aliens, to discuss the higher meanings that lay beyond space and time. One was here, standing in front of him, as bold as brass, accusing him of crimes that, thanks to this race of cosmic policemen, he could never commit. Stuart had simply had enough. "You really are a hypocritical bastard," he stated. "What the hell do you think you're doing, bursting in here after all you did? For a godlike being, you show an alarming lack of omnipotence." Single quote. The man recoiled. "How dare I? How dare I?" He shook his head in disbelief. "How dare I? Hyde, you're tampering with reality here. What do you think you're doing?" Stuart picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'm going to dinner, Doctor. Would you care to join me? Because if you do, I know just the place." Chapter 2. Holding out for a hero. Arlene looked at her watch and sighed. It was gone midnight and she was absolutely exhausted. Yet another night without sleep. But she and Paul were making real progress here, weren't they? She shook her head. Whatever the results, she really needed to go to bed. Paul turned from the master console with a quizzical look. Paul's favorite word, it would seem. Well, did it work? A typical Titan run could take 4 or 5 hours. Unfortunately, since it wasn't designed for George Lucas-style special effects, there wasn't really any way of telling whether it had worked. And since Paul had spent most of the last 4 hours hunched over the master console, occasionally scratching his beard and uttering the odd Arlene was none the wiser. Paul's face fell, assuming the look of an abused puppy, his deep brown eyes full of sadness. "I'm sorry, Arlene, we're still not quite there." Single quote. Arlene sighed. Yet another failure. Perhaps she should just call it a day and throw herself into her singing. At least that was one area where she was better than Paul. "Hey." Paul stood up and hugged her. "It doesn't matter. We've got unlimited funding and unlimited time," he whispered into her ear. "And we're getting closer, I know it." Arlene moved her head and kissed him. "Let's call it a night." "I'm shattered." Paul nodded. "We'll run through the penetration envelope with Stuart tomorrow. Perhaps we'll spot something." "Good idea." She checked her watch once more. 12:15 a.m. If Stuart's got any sense, he'll be fast asleep by now. "That is marvelous. Absolutely bloody marvelous," said Stuart Hyde in his rich, throaty voice, as he placed his just-emptied wine glass on the green and white tablecloth, just next to the empty plate that had once been covered with grilled lobster in garlic oil. "Far better than marmalade sandwiches and Moroccan burgundy, don't you think?" Entranced by the food, carbonara, of course, drink a glorious Kronos. Hermitage and Company, the multifaceted Stuart Hyde, and deliberately distracting himself from darker matters, the Doctor decided to agree. There was a choice of emergencies, and he had to choose, save himself or save the Earth. And he knew the answer. There really was no alternative. There never was. As he took another sip of the Kronos Hermitage, the 1935, and an all-time classic, he realized that it had been nearly 4 years since he had last sampled the delights of La Belladonna. In real terms, it had been scarcely less. 4 years. 4 years to forget the sybaritic pleasures of the best-kept secret in the West End, a members-only restaurant down Hanway Street, a tiny curved side street joining Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road. 4 years, give or take a year, to forget that he had been introduced to its charms by Dame Anne Travers, just before her untimely death. 4 years. Was that all it took, a Time Lord to cleanse his soul? No, that way leads to. With determination, he raised his glass of Kronos Hermitage and toasted Anne's memory. "Absent friends," he said, pleased that Stuart clinked his glass against his. "Dame Anne. Such a waste. Perhaps this one act goes some way towards making up for that," she had whispered. If only it could have. If only it could make Chip for much, much more. And now it turned out that Stuart Hyde was also a member of La Belladonna. Small universe. Small number of plots, Aristotle had said to him one evening, over a goblet of delicious honeyed wine. Too small. I just hope history really isn't going to repeat itself. The Doctor had no choice but to return his attention to the here and now. He had to choose between emergencies. There were more important considerations that were even greater than a night in one of the best restaurants in the universe. Even greater considerations. Yes, much greater. As great as the time traces blazing from the Chapel Institute of West London University. But as much as the Doctor wanted to leap in and ask questions directly, it was obvious that this wouldn't get to him anywhere. Stuart Hyde had been wounded, his personality severely bruised. And although the Doctor suspected he knew the reason, he also knew that Stuart wanted to talk, which was the least he owed him. 30 years ago Stuart Hyde had been lab assistant to a lab assistant, helping his colleague Dr. Ruth Ingram in experiments to transmit matter through interstitial time. Project Tomtit. But Tomtit had been a cover for a far more sinister experiment. Professor Thascales, the suave genius responsible for Tomtit, had been anything but a visiting academic from Athens University. He had been their Doctor's arch-nemesis, the Master, bent on yet another of his twisted schemes. It was true that Tomtit was capable of moving solid objects through their interstices of reality, taking advantage of the granularity of space-time. But that was nothing more than a side effect, the unique selling point that Professor Thascales had used to drain hundreds of thousands of pounds from the Newton Institute budget. In truth, the project was much, much more. Its true purpose was to breach the crystal of Kronos, a multidimensional prison containing a godlike being, Kronos, greatest and most fearsome of the Chronovores, hiding on Earth after yet another of his mad schemes had forced him to lie low. For a while, double-crossed by the Vords, indeed. The Master had taken advantage of the scientific pioneering of Stuart and Ruth and betrayed them. Tomtit had released Kronos, that was true. But Kronos was a vengeful god, and his freedom had destroyed Atlantis and almost cost the Doctor, his assistant, Joe Grant, and the Master their lives. And, for a time, it had cost Stuart Hyde his youth. The name Chronovores described these beings accurately. They indeed ate time. They fed on timelines. The timelines of people, of planets, of entire realities. And Stuart had been unlucky enough to have been a light morsel upon which Kronos fed after his release, his 25-year-old frame aging to his dotage within seconds. He had recovered. But somehow the Doctor doubted that that was the experience which had scarred him so deeply. Something else had hurt to him badly enough to leave him embittered. Even after 30 years. Unfortunately, the Doctor's recollections of events following the defeat of their Master were hazy. Very soon afterwards, he had been given back his freedom by the High Council of the Time Lords, and he had left UNIT to clear up the mess the Master had caused. Over the last couple of years, however, he had come to learn that UNIT's definition of clearing up left an awful lot to be desired. What happened? He asked quietly. What happened after the Master? Stuart shrugged. The same thing that I imagine happens after any breach in national security. A lot of men in dark suits turned up, confiscated everything pertaining to Tomtit, and vanished. The Doctor stared into the dark ruby surface of his wine for a second before looking up and subjecting Stuart to the same penetrating gaze. I meant to you. Oh, I carried on in academia, Doctor. With Ruth's patronage, one research post led to another. I obtained my doctorate and took a series of chairs at various universities, Reading, Sussex, Luton, Warwick, ending up as emeritus professor of physics at West London. He raised an eyebrow. Quite a career, eh? He was feigning nonchalance, but the Doctor knew it went a lot deeper. He frowned. Somebody like Stuart Hyde should have been sitting comfortably at CERN, or replacing Anne Travers as scientific advisor to the cabinet after her death. Even scientific advisor to UNIT, for goodness sake. But a professor at a university? Your experience, Stuart? Surely that must have counted for something? Stuart twirled his wineglass in his hand. Experience? He slammed the glass on the table. What experience? Ruth and I thought we were developing the technology that would change the world, Doctor. Instantaneous transmission of matter. All transportation problems solved. No more food shortages. Interstellar travel beckoned. But what did we have to do with it? At the end of the day, it was your friend who developed Tomtit, not us. Friend. Once, long ago, the Master had been his best friend. The Doctor, the Master and the others of the Deca, the 10 Time Lord acolytes who had thought that they would make a difference, who had thought that they could change their universe. In many ways, they had. But how could the Doctor consider someone who could rob a perfectly decent human being of his self-confidence, his self-respect, his pride, a friend? He leant forward and gazed into Stuart's eyes. Stuart, listen to me. There was a very good reason why the Master came to Earth to find help in releasing Kronos. Because of Atlantis, Stuart snapped back. That was the link. The Doctor shook his head. Didn't you learn anything from that incident? As far as Kronos is concerned, time and space are irrelevant. The crystal of Kronos has been hidden on millions of worlds since the dawn of time. The Master could have just as easily gone to the planet of the Daleks. Seeing Stuart's blank look, he carried on. As you know, the Master and I are both Time Lords, members of a race that developed time travel millions of years ago. Single quote. Stuart's eyes widened. Millions of years ago. So why aren't you gods? Single quote. Because we tried to be, said the Doctor sadly. On countless worlds, we thought we knew best. And on countless worlds, we saw the consequences of our actions. On Minos we helped them to split their world in two in a nuclear war. On Clist we taught them to reverse evolution. And on the starlit ring of Plastridis 14 we sent an entire civilization totally, utterly mad. The Doctor took a deep swig of his wine. The Time Lords of Gallifrey are capable of amazing things, Stuart. But we have our faults and our weaknesses. We are arrogant, we are capable of questionable acts. We're not gods, Stuart. But we soon recognized that there was a race out there that was capable of godhood. A race more powerful than the high and mighty Time Lords. Stuart sneered. Yes, said the Doctor. You. Ha. Stuart snorted. Don't patronize me, Doctor. Time to talk out of class. Perish the thought. Humanity is an amazing species. Professor Hyde. I have watched your race crawl from the primordial swamp to inhabit the galaxy. I have watched mankind fight against the most overwhelming odds to survive. I have watched it take on the worst this cosmos can manage and win. I have also watched how my people regard your race, Stuart, with a mixture of fear and envy. I also know that at the very end of time. He broke off. If he said any more, he was at risk of doing. There are some things mankind is not meant to know. But there was no choice. He was going to have to do it. There are some things mankind is not meant to know. What were the Time Lords going to do? Put him on trial again? Was there another Valeyard waiting in the wings, ready to prosecute him? Humanity is one of the few races in the universe which has an instinctive understanding of time travel. Stuart, Stattenheim and Waldorf put together a working blueprint of a TARDIS in their 16th century, while Lasseter and Monroe encroached upon Time Lord technology in the 11th millennium. He smiled at the memory. Throughout history, humanity will keep on stumbling upon time travel, and my people will try to stop that understanding, constantly, indefatigably. Although whether the Time Lords are acting out of jealousy or out of fear is another question. And finally your race wins, and inherits our mantle, just before the final end of this universe. Stuart's gaze dropped to his empty wine glass. Why are you telling me this, Doctor? To make me feel better? Because if you are, it isn't working. Single quote. The Doctor was forced to admit partial defeat. Clearly, the Master had dealt a bitter blow to Stuart's pride in his own achievements, and there was little chance of the Doctor's repairing that over a 3-course meal. But it was worth a try. If you must know, yes, he stated, slamming his hands on the table and causing the maitre d' to look round. The Master needed your ingenuity, that human ingenuity that the majority of Time Lords lack, to release Kronos. Without you and Ruth, Tomtin would never have been built. That's what I've been trying to tell you, man. He couldn't have managed it on his own. He lacks the imagination. Only you and Ruth could have done it. Stuart gave him a wry look. Despite everything, Doctor, I believe you. He grinned. I do believe you. But that still doesn't explain why you're here. Why am I here? The Doctor raised an eyebrow and smiled. He'd won. Now for the hard part. I'm here because I think you've been a very naughty boy. Mel turned over and over beneath the thin sheets of the hotel bed, unable to sleep. Whether that was due to the humid August night or the thoughts that flared in her mind, she didn't know, and didn't care. It seemed that Angelica had moved out of her flat a couple of years ago and their new occupant didn't have a forwarding address, although he did think she was still working at the university. Which was quite lucky, since Mel had discovered that she was actually in 2003. The Doctor couldn't even get that right. Then, again, late by 3 years. She knew she should be grateful that it wasn't 3 centuries. Walking away from the flat, she had realized that she was in a bit of a quandary. Having decided to leave the TARDIS, she had been convinced that her world, would accept her readily. Unfortunately, that didn't appear to be their case. And since it wasn't all going to be handed to her on a plate, she was going to have to take matters into her own hands. Mel's impeccable memory had reminded her that there was somewhere to stay. 10 minutes up the Great West Road. The Osterley Hotel, with its bar favoured by the oh-so-mature students of West London University and the underage schoolboys of Isleworth Grammar School. Staying there seemed her best strategy until she could contact Angelica, or, indeed, anyone from her past. So she lugged her holder up the busy A4 until she reached the squat white buildings of the hotel. Checking in, grateful for the Doctor's gift of what amounted to over 15,000. She had thought of her room on board the TARDIS with its creature comforts. But there wasn't a hotel on Earth with a holographic TV and a library of every book ever written, nor was there one with a 0G jacuzzi or a food machine that could replicate any meal in the known universe. Mel was going to have to settle for satellite TV and an ensuite bathroom, and get used to it. As she plumped up her pillow and tried to clear her mind, she began to question her decision. Despite everything, was the Doctor all right? Images of Paul, Arlene and Angelica swirled around for a few minutes, intercut with the ruins of Maradnias and an old, broken Time Lord before her. Exhaustion overcame in her and she finally fell into a deep yet fitful sleep. After another hour in La Belladonna, skirting around the real issues, the Doctor realized that he was no closer to understanding what was going on. There was the odd clue, the occasional snippet of information, but nothing concrete. Thankfully, Stuart appeared to be in the mood to carry on talking and drinking, and had suggested that they retire to his flat for a nightcap. The Doctor had readily agreed. Stuart's flat in Great Titchfield Street, 20 minutes walk down a still busy Oxford Street from La Belladonna, was compact yet homely, with a huge kitchen. Apparently Stuart had swapped their bedroom and the kitchen around when he had first moved in, since the bedroom had been bigger. He had obviously grown into a bon vivant, if the well-stocked fridge and cupboards were anything to go by. The kitchen also contained a very generous supply of all manner of alcoholic beverages. Soon after he had settled into this body, the Doctor had discovered that he once again liked the odd tipple. His fifth incarnation, up there on his rented high moral ground, had been virtually teetotal, but the sixth Doctor relished both their taste and effects of alcohol. True, his Gallifreyan metabolism could overcome the effects in a trice, but it was still highly enjoyable getting drunk. Sometimes it was good to get away from it all. As he was now, slumped in one of Stuart's capacious armchairs like some multicolored scatter cushion. Another, Dr. Stuart Hyde was brandishing a very large vodka and tonic, ice and a slice. The Doctor's fifth, with Stuart not far behind. The evenings. Young. "Don't mind if I do," said the Doctor, slurring as he took the proffered glass, his taking of it matching Stuart's haphazard delivery. A lie, but the truth was he needed to know about the time trace, and getting Stuart off guard like this, although underhand, was probably the best way, especially given how crucial it was to find out about the trace. Whatever the technology in the university was, it was almost identical to Tomtit, but slightly more sophisticated. Some of the rough edges that Tomtit's time trace had exhibited, those edges that had caused time distortion when the device was in operation, had been cleaned up. But it was definitely son of Tomtit, as Stuart had described it to him. But how could that be if C-19, the government's black ops and dirty tricks department, had retrieved all the hardware and information about Tomtit for safekeeping at the vault, like it was supposed to do? Then again, it wasn't exactly unknown for the vault's alien technology to fall into the wrong hands. Was it? The Doctor thought of Shane Annette, and then thought of Mel, and decided not to pursue that particular line of memory. The fact was, someone at West London University was delving into time travel in such a manner that the Doctor had to stop them. The reason wasn't the notion of mankind developing time travel. He'd be damned if he was going to become a proper little Time Lord at his age, and Tomtit was nursery school stuff as far as those stuffed shirts on Gallifrey were concerned. It was the fact that their culprit was doing it in such a way that they might very well attract the attention of beings who would think nothing of destroying the Earth to stop them. Although the Time Lords didn't usually employ such heavy-handed techniques, the Doctor's experiences with Ravelarks had made him wary of his own people. But he knew that it wasn't him he should really worry about. There were others for whom restraint was a dirty word, such as the Chronovores. They would recognize the signature time trace of Tomtit, and the Doctor doubted they would be overjoyed to realize that someone was employing the same technology that had enslaved one of their own. And the vengeance of the Chronovores was terrible to see. "Remember Atlantis?" "So," said the Doctor, placing his glass on the coffee table. "What has your protégé been doing?" "Kairos, wasn't it?" Stuart nodded. "Boy's a genius, Doctor. Knows more about temporal physics than I ever could." "So how did he learn about Tomtit?" Single quote. Stuart hesitated for a moment, but it was obvious that his pride in Kairos achievements was going to win through. And it did. "Paul was the brightest student I had ever taught, Doctor. Before long, it was very obvious that there was nothing more I could tell him about temporal physics. I chose to remove him from the class and tutor him privately. Before long, he was teaching me. And so you chose to confide in him as well, said the doctor. You told him about Tomtit, which, I ought to add, is in direct violation of the official Secrets Act that unit made you sign. Not that it had ever worried the doctor. Stuart laughed, a deep, throaty cackle. Do you really think I was bothered? Doctor. Yes, I told Paul about Tomtit. But I did more than that, I showed him it. What? Once again, the spectre of C-19 loomed. But how is that possible? Everything pertaining to Tomtit was appropriated by Unit's murky little friends. Is that what you were going to say, Doctor? The doctor could only nod. Perhaps they weren't as thorough as they thought they were. A sly smile crossed Stuart's face. Or perhaps they thought the box of tricks they were wheeling out of the door actually was Tomtit, rather than a hastily put together contraption of broken motherboards and fused transistors. The doctor couldn't help but laugh at the man's audacity. You mean? Stuart nodded. Tomtit is sitting in a store cupboard at the university, Doctor. Single quote. His expression hardened. Whether I created it or not, Tomtit was mine and Ruth's. And I'd have been damned if I was going to give it to those goons in suits. But Paul's not using Tomtit, is he? Oh no, Doctor. For Paul, that was just the starting point. The boy reverse-engineered back to first principles and built something far, far superior. His eyes lost their focus, as if he was staring beyond the confines of his flat. He built the Titan array. With that, Stuart collapsed back in his chair and started to snore rather loudly. The doctor realized that Stuart's eyes had become unfocused because he was drunk. Taking a sip from his vodka and tonic, while clearing the alcohol from his system at the same time, the doctor was intrigued. What was the Titan array? A beautiful August morning. The birds were singing in Osterley Park, the sky was cloudless and the sun was bright but not overpowering. Mel had to admit that, despite her troubled night, she felt a million times better. As she stepped out of the hotel into the sunlight, her time with the doctor had lost its edge. She realized that she was quite looking forward to always knowing what planet she woke up on. The university was about 10 minutes walk down the Great West Road, a leisurely saunter during which she could enjoy the beginnings of a new life. Mel adjusted her Oakley sunglasses and picked up her holdall. She couldn't wait to see Angelica again. As far as I'm concerned, you can go and screw yourself. Angelica Whitefriar sat back in her leather chair and gave a patronizing smile. As Director of Intellectual Property Marketing, her job was simple, to take their patents, proposals and products of the various departments at the university and make money out of them. And the wheedling stick insect in front of her wasn't offering her anything she could bring to market. An intelligent toaster, indeed. Ms. Whitefriar, the stick insect bleated. Go. Now. Before I snap you in half, you pathetic little man. With that, Angelica started reading the latest edition of Computing, waiting for the satisfying thud of the door shutting. Angelica looked up and grinned. I love my job, she thought, not for the first time. She glanced at her wafer-thin Dell laptop and checked her emails. More obsequious requests for funding, more far-fetched ideas which would never see the light of day. Nothing that would boost the not inconsiderable coffers of their university. Not that Angelique was particularly worried. Sales of the Whitefriar lattice were going through the roof, and thanks to her lucrative contract with the university, 0.01%, she was already a multimillionaire. If she was totally honest, her job was nothing more than a hobby, something to occupy her time, and a wonderful opportunity for her to throw her not inconsiderable weight around. Her phone trilled at her. Whitefriar, she snapped, irritated at the interruption. But as soon as she heard what her PA had to say, her sour face beamed. Melanie Bush. Morning, Stuart. I took advantage of your superb kitchen and rustled us up some eggs Benedict. Hope you don't mind. It's waiting in the living room. A prod in the chest. Hurry, don't want the hollandaise sauce to get cold, do we? Stuart opened his eyes and tried to focus them. For a second, he couldn't work out why there was a man in an iridescent black and white waistcoat with a vivid purple polka dot cravat standing over him. Then he remembered. The doctor. Be with you in a couple of secs, Doc, he murmured. Just make sure you are, said the doctor. We've got a long day ahead of us. Once again, Paul let out a series of mewling squeals as he thrashed about in their bed, before his cries finally died away. Arlene was still totally exhausted. There was no way she could have had a good night's sleep with Paul lying next to her in his present state, the sheets soaked with sweat. As she extracted herself from the duvet and smoothed down her pajamas, she had to admit to herself that she was worried. For the last couple of weeks, Paul's sleep had been fitful at best. She knew they were both working hard, but this was more than simply overwork. Paul had something on his mind, but he refused to confide in Arlene. She knew she was going to have to live with it. With a final glance at Paul, now sleeping peacefully, she padded into the kitchen to make breakfast. In his white pink shirt, his charcoal Paul Smith suit and the burgundy Armani tie he had found in his wardrobe, the master felt underdressed. But it would have to do. His fruitful morning, constructing another identity for himself, was more important than his appearance. Almost. It was second nature to him, Magister, Keller, Thascales, Estrom. Intricately woven lives that he had made his own. And this time was no different. Moments after his TARDIS had infiltrated the various computer systems that codified the inhabitants of both this benighted city and the rubble of Belgrade, the master was picking up his new birth certificate, his national insurance number, his Serbian passport. All the little bits of paper and strings of numbers that defined human beings in their 21st century. All perfectly replicated by his TARDIS. As he filed a new credit card in his pigskin wallet, he couldn't help but grin. He was no longer the master. He was now Branko Gospodar, a businessman from Serbia. A man who had an appointment at West London University with the certain Angelique Whitefriar. Mel. Angelique leapt from behind her desk and embraced her. It's so good to see you. Mel responded to the hugging kind, but there was something not quite right about all of this. Was she being paranoid, or just sensible? There was something different about Angelique. Something unpleasant. Where have you been? Angelique cried, after barking an order for coffee and herbal tea down her phone. I knew that you were at the reunion, Chantal told me. Surprise, surprise. I so wanted to make it, but business got in the way, always does, I'm afraid. I saw in the Millennium negotiating terms for a new network for the university with an oily French computer magnate, sitting in a hotel room overlooking the Seine. Sounds wonderful, said Mel, remembering the events of her own millennium. It was when he could keep his hands to himself. Saved nearly £3.5 million for the university. Angelica indicated a chair. Have a seat. As Mel sat down, she still couldn't overcome her unease. Angelica looked the same, slightly dumpy, long straight brown hair falling down her shoulders and back, the same old maid dresses, but there was an edge to her. A nasty edge. So, where have you been? Angelica repeated. After the reunion you just seemed to vanish. When I got back from Paris I asked Julia and Chantal, but they didn't know. This was the difficult bit. I went traveling again. I decided to see the world. This world and countless others. At that point the door opened. A handsome young man entered, bearing a laden tray. Angelica indicated the table between herself and Mel, and subsequently ignored him. Well, I have to say, traveling's been good for you. You don't look any older than you did at university. Healthy living and a clear conscience, Mel answered, well aware that she had used the line before. What else can I say? Anyway, I'm back now. Angelica grabbed her hand. I'm glad. She eyed the tray. Chamomile all right? Impressed by Angelica's memory, she nodded. That would be wonderful. Single quote. As Angelica poured, she gestured around the room, hung with pictures. If they weren't reproductions, they were worth hundreds of thousands. What do you think about The Office? Not bad for someone who got a third in comp she, is it? Mel had to admit the room was impressive, but the trappings were irrelevant. This wasn't the Angelica that she had been at university with, and she wanted to know why. So, said Mel, sipping her coffee. What do you do, exactly? Angelica grinned. I keep this place running, Mel. From a financial point of view, now that the chapel bursary has dried up. Ashley Chapel. Mel's thoughts about him were unprintable, even for her. The idea that that person had had his claws in her old university. But Angelica was still talking. I find the research projects which I think are viable, and arrange for them to be brought to market. She narrowed her eyes. Surely you must have heard of their Whitefriar lattice. Mel shook her head. You really have been traveling, haven't you? I didn't think there was anywhere on this planet that hadn't heard of it, Angelica said with clear disbelief. The lattice is part of virtually every electronic device around. Single quote. I have been to some pretty remote places, said Mel, trying to sound apologetic. She searched her memory. Is it a bit like the micromonolithic circuit? 4 years ago, the same claim was being made for that by Ashley Chapel. Angelica smiled. Dear old Ashley's toy. Yesterday's technology. Mel. The Whitefriar lattice is a revolutionary device which has made the transistor completely obsolete. And the micromonolithic circuit is nothing more than a glorified transistor. The lattice manipulates photons at a quantum level. No more clumsy heat sinks and fans. Today's processors can operate at speeds that were once physically impossible. She reached round to her desk and picked up what appeared to be a mobile phone. This PDA has the processing power of a desktop PC from 2 years ago. And in a year, something this size will be capable of quantum computing, an entire new generation of technology. All very impressive, thought Mel, but it did sound as if Angelica were reciting the marketing brochure rather than actually understanding what she was talking about. And don't forget that 78% of the grid runs on the Whitefire lattice, she added, bringing unlimited processing power to everyone. The grid, the Doctor had explained that one to her, trying to lighten up their journey away from the planet of the Sporids and their vicious and unnatural ways. Some revolutionary technological advance in the year 2001 meant that it had soon been possible to take advantage of all the spare processing power of all the computers linked to the internet. Every last gigahertz of idle time, every spare gigabyte of storage from every computer, could be pulled into a dissociated cloud of processing power and memory, available as easily as electricity or gas. Was the Whitefire lattice the advance that had made it all possible? Was Mel's old roommate the technological visionary who had changed the world? And if so, how? So when did you invent it? Asked Mel, amazed that her old friend, someone who had struggled through the technical parts of their computer science degree, could have come up with something so revolutionary. She wasn't prepared for the cruel, calculating, spiteful look that darkened Angeliqua's face. Invent it? Me? Angeliqua laughed. But it wasn't a pretty laugh. It was a cackle, verging on a shriek. She handed over a small clump of foamy metallic wire. The words, Whitefire lattice, were clearly visible in small white letters on their nodes interspersed in the wire. Mel, my percentage of the Whitefire lattice has made me one of the richest women on this planet. I have homes in 4 countries, and more lovers than you could ever believe. She sipped her coffee. But can you really see me getting my hands dirty? I hardly know how to wire a plug. Our dear old friend Paul invented it, of course. Mel frowned. Paul. Ah, Paul. If you mean Paul Kairos, then yes. So Paul was the visionary. But if Angeliqua was this rich, where was Paul in their equation? Indulging his passion for rare American comics, married to Arlene, and living in a castle somewhere. Angeliqua's next words put paid to all of that. Unfortunately, under the terms and conditions of his contract here, poor Paul didn't get a penny. She pursed her lips. He doesn't even get to go down in history. She sipped her coffee. Unlike me, of course. That was the point at which Mel realized how Angeliqua had changed. She was no longer the happy-go-lucky student, game for a laugh, letting her hair down at dinner parties. Something had happened, something so fundamental that it had drained all their good from her, filling her up with bitterness, spite and hate. What in God's name had happened to her? Before Mel could get to the bottom of it, a bleep issued from Angeliqua's PDA. She checked the tiny screen before looking up. I'm sorry, Mel, but I'm going to have to cut this short. I've got another meeting in 5 minutes. Some low-level dignitary from the former Yugoslavia wants to write me a very big check. She picked up a card from her desk and handed it to Mel. Give me a ring later, in about 2 hours, say. Perhaps we can have lunch. Mel found it hard to reconcile this Angeliqua, eager to rekindle their friendship with the woman who had shown such glee in getting one over on Paul. And even harder to reconcile it with the Angeliqua she had known at university. Given that Mel's plans had hinged upon staying with her, everything now appeared to be fraying at the edges. For a second, she thought about the Doctor. Halfway across the galaxy by now, fighting the good fight. But who was at his side? But Mel had made her bed. For better or for worse, she had to accept that she was never going to see the Doctor again. The taxi pulled up outside the high-energy physics block of the university, the grandly titled Chapel Institute, and Stuart and the doctor got out. Stuart was still feeling a little delicate, but decades of drinking himself into oblivion gave him a familiarity with the condition and the experience to overcome it. Usually, unless he had an overexcitable Time Lord in tow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a solid silver hip flask, a present from Ruth Ingram, and took a long swig of whiskey. "I have to say that I'm really looking forward to this," said the doctor, rubbing his hands together. "Can't wait to see what it does." "Young Kairos will be only too pleased to explain, Doctor," said Stuart as he signed his companion in at reception, and handed over a smart card. To be honest, it's more difficult getting him to keep his mouth shut. Single quote. As they reached the door that led to the Titan array, Stuart gently pulled on their doctor's arm. "Just a word of warning, Doctor." As well as telling him about Tomtit, "I also told him about your lot, the Time Lords. Perhaps you ought to be prepared for a less than favorable reaction." The doctor shrugged. "I'm sure my natural charm will be sufficient to win him over, Professor Hyde." Led on. Stuart couldn't help but grimace. If only he could be as confident. The smartly dressed man in the doorway, his hair slicked back, his mouth framed by a black goatee, gave her a warm smile of greeting. But somehow the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Those very, very deep eyes. Angelica tore herself away. "Mr. Gospodar," she said crisply, inviting him to take a seat. She was impressed. Even now, 4 years after the Kosovo War and the return of democracy, she knew that things were still unstable in Belgrade. So it was quite difficult to reconcile the images of queues for food she had seen on Sky News with their immaculate attire worn by her guest. Then again, given the flourishing black market in his country, perhaps the charcoal Paul Smith suit shouldn't have come as a complete surprise. Indeed, if he was going to give her even half the sum that had been discussed over the phone, his clothing was a reassurance. "Madam Whitefriar, it is very good of you to see me at such short notice." His accent was thick, but not impenetrable. If anything, it was rather sexy. Gospodar took her hand and kissed it. "I know that you are a very busy and very important woman, but I believe that what I can offer you will be to our mutual advantage." He waited for Angelica to sit down before taking a seat. "Mr. Gospodar, I have to say that details you provided were rather sketchy." The Serbian nodded sagely. "And for good reasons. I am authorized by my government to negotiate a contract with your university for the provision of certain equipment that we believe will be vital in the reconstruction of our country." Equipment? Angelica's job involved the licensing of patents, rather than actual box shifting. If this charming stranger wanted equipment, he was sadly barking up the wrong tree. "Are you sure you have the right person, Mr. Gospodar?" "I think you might be mistaken." "I do not think so, dear lady." He stared into her eyes, those endless black pools, drawing her in. "I believe that I have come to just the right person." He reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing gently. Angelica couldn't resist. "For us to work together, however, I must be sure that you trust me." "You to trust me, Angelica?" Of course she didn't. She had only met the man minutes ago. But somehow she found it difficult to protest. "You see, my dear, I can offer you something beyond money. Beyond anything." that you could possibly comprehend. I can offer you power. Had his accent changed? Angelica went to pull away from his hands, from his eyes, but she couldn't. No, she didn't want to. It was as if this strange Serbian's mind was within hers, exploring her memories, her thoughts, her desires. There was no trace of an accent when he continued. You see, I am the master. I am the master and you will obey me. You will obey me. Single quote. At that moment, Angelica knew that there was nothing that she wouldn't do for him. For her new master. The Doctor was unsure what to expect as Stewart opened the door to the Titan array. The 30 years since he had last seen him had seen some of the most rapid advances in human technology in that race's entire history: the Internet, the grid, the Whitefriar lattice. Tomtit had been a collection of boxy units filled with printed circuits and some very dodgy wiring, 1970s technology trying to reach for Time Lord understanding. The Master Terminal, what a term, had been in the main part of the lab, while the Slave Terminal, powered by the Newton Institute's primitive nuclear reactor, had been in a lead-lined anteroom. All very parochial. The Titan array was anything but. The room was a cube, 15 meters aside, the walls, floor and ceiling smooth white marble. It was more like the Tate Modern than a scientific research institute. The illumination came from what looked like purple neon tubing set into all 12 edges of the room, giving everything a crisp, antiseptic appearance, something that was bolstered by the pervasive tang of ozone that accompanied all high-energy experiments. But that was just the room. It was what the room contained that impressed their Doctor. At the very center, 8 meters above them, hung a translucent, pulsing sphere of ruby crystal, 3 meters across, held in place by 8 thin steel rods. Each rod reached outwards from the center until it hit the corresponding corner of the room, where a metallic web of circuitry held it in place. It was like standing inside a huge cat's cradle of chrome and crystal. On closer inspection, the Doctor realized that what he had first taken for neon lighting was actually even more circuitry, linking the 8 vertices of the room together, knotted ropes of luminous glassy fibers. And the nature of the illumination suggested that Kairos was using some kind of accelerated blacklight conversion technique, very advanced. Indeed, perhaps slightly too advanced for 2003. A single, thicker rod ran from the sphere to the floor, where 8 parallel conduits connected it to a shining chrome console about 4.5 meters from their doorway in which the Doctor stood. 2 figures were leaning over the console. A thick-set man in his late 30s with short hair, olive skin and a beard, and a taller, elegant black woman, her hair in a bun. They were disagreeing quietly. Stewart coughed politely, alerting them to his and the Doctor's presence. They turned round in unison. Stewart. The man came bounding up enthusiastically, the woman gliding behind him. I was hoping you'd pop in. There's something we wanted you to check over for us. Maybe a bit later, Paul. He gestured towards the Doctor. I'd like you to meet someone. He paused and the Doctor could sense the tension, the apprehension, in Stewart's voice. This is the Doctor. The Doctor. Paul frowned for a second, before realization dawned on his face. The Doctor. The one who... Stewart, and the Doctor, nodded. Paul sighed. You bastard. As that polite epithet rung in the Doctor's ears, Paul turned on his heel and returned to the chrome console, pointedly ignoring both the Doctor and Stewart. Stewart shrugged. I did warn you, Doc. Leave this to me. He walked over to the console, the doctor in tow. Please, Paul, listen to me, Stuart insisted. But his protégé was having none of it. The woman was keeping out of the way, the doctor noted. Very wise. Why should I? Paul's face was twisted with a mixture of emotions, anger, jealousy, and concern. Concern for Stuart and what he had suffered at the hands of the Time Lords, the doctor guessed. Just think what we could have done if he'd decided to share his precious knowledge with us, rather than just dangling it in front of you and Ruth. The doctor shook his head. He was going to regret this, but it was time to get involved. He stepped forward. Professor Kairos, you have to understand. It wasn't the time travel that was the problem, although my people do have a tendency to be a little protective where that is concerned. It was Kronos. Surely, your mentor has told you about that creature. What it was capable of. That was years ago, said Paul. Years. Years? What is time to the Chronovores? The doctor snorted. We're talking about beings billions of years old. How is that possible? It was the woman. I'm Paul's partner, Dr. Professor Arlene Cole. Professional and personal. She added, shaking his hand. Life couldn't develop that long ago. The physical nature of the cosmos was inimical to life at that time. Human life. Life based on cold hard matter, yes. But the Chronovores aren't made of baryonic matter. Paul raised an eyebrow. Living non-baryonic matter? The doctor waved a multicolored sleeve at the Titan. A ray. And why not? I thought you were a genius. In their natural form there. Chronovores exist as six-dimensional polymorphic lattices of photons and chronons, bound by superstrings. Nonsense, yelled Paul. The doctor groaned. Human life is made from the remnants of population 2. Stars, star stuff. The transcendental beings are made from the very fabric of time itself, time stuff. Now do you? Paul snorted. I've never heard such overblown claptrap. Has Stuart actually explained what the Titan array is? The doctor had to admit that, until this point, he had simply assumed that Titan was a glorified tomtit, a high-class matter transmitter. Perhaps it was time to find out more. Actually, Professor Kairos, he hasn't. Would you care to elucidate? Paul laid his hands on the chrome console. The transinterstitial time analysis network, Titan, isn't like Tomtit, Doctor, although I did base it on some of Tomtit's principles. We're taking advantage of the granular nature of time. Just as Tomtit does, but for an entirely different reason. We're trying to touch the face of God. Paul, stop being so melodramatic, said Arlene, giving his right hand an affectionate pat. Doctor, basically Titan is the biggest microscope ever made. We're trying to penetrate Calabi-Yau space. Does that mean anything to you? Indeed it does. Perhaps there was a chance that these humans would actually understand. But before he could say anything further, Stuart took up the story. The doctor suspected he was feeling left out. His rich voice took on the manner of a university lecturer. Which, of course, he was. When the universe was created, dimensions started to solidify out of the primal chaos. But 5 got there first, the 3 spatial dimensions and 2 of time. The doctor couldn't bite his tongue any longer. They might be a trinity of professors, but the doctor had learnt this in elementary class at the academy. Holding his hands up in protest, he remembered one of his primers, Rassilon's Guide to the Multiverse, Volume 3. The one without the pictures. At the risk of sounding like a high and mighty Time Lord, I am a high and mighty Time Lord. And to quote one of my elementary texts in the matter, and in the aftermath of Event Zero, 11 dimensions did fight for existence. 5 were triumphant. Together they did become the 3 dimensions of space, and the 2 dimensions of time through which we travel. But the remaining 6 dimensions did still exist, although beaten, although denied their dominance. They curled and curdled amongst themselves to become a 6-fold universe. Separate yet conjoined. They formed a realm all their own, a universe in which the transcendental beings could thrive and prosper without interference from the lesser beings. A realm protected by the great and ancient covenant. Although we and the transcendental beings share the time vortex, the covenant divides us. But the 6-fold realm is denied us by the covenant, and it is a covenant that we dare not transgress. You see, even the Time Lords have kept away from what you call Calabi-Yau space. We simply left it alone, as most sensible races have done. Until now, said Paul. The aim of the Titan array is to reach into Calabi-Yau space, to examine it. Doctor, this is man's greatest achievement. Single quote. Man's greatest folly, more like advancing human knowledge. Paul yelled back. Or does that offend your Time Lord sensibilities? This is nothing to do with that, and I wish you would get it through that thick skull of yours that I am not some kind of a galactic policeman. Paul, Calabi-Yau space is more than just a scientific curiosity. The transcendental beings call it the 6-fold realm. It's their home. With Tomtit, you were simply knocking on the door. With Titan, you're inviting yourself in and making a cup of tea. The creatures that live there are beyond your comprehension. They're beyond mine. Come to that. Leave, well, alone. Paul shook his head. With Titan we can examine the fundamental nature of reality, Doctor. Surf the quantum foam, examine superstrings firsthand, map their topology of Calabi-Yau space. Doctor, this is our chance to understand our place in the universe. The tenacity of human beings was one of their greatest gifts. But it was also one of their most annoying faults. The Doctor remembered an apposite quote. For there was time before this, and there was being before this, and there was space before this, and there were things damned in that place, and there were things remarkable. And that's from the book of the old time. We're dealing with the things damned, Paul. I'm sorry, Doctor, but that is total bollocks. Was there no way to make them understand? Understand this, Paul. The moment you enter Calabi-Yau space, you will light a beacon. A beacon that the Chronovores will pounce upon. The Doctor turned his back on them in disgust. And at that point, your place in the universe will be nothing more than fodder for the Chronovores. Doctor. It was Arlene, the blessed still point in the room, it seemed. You said earlier that these creatures lived in something called the time vortex. What has that got to do with Calabi-Yau space? Finally, an intelligent question. The Doctor turned round in his chair. The time vortex is the second temporal dimension. It's the region through which TARDISes travel, the region that Tomtit creates a gap through to enable matter transmission. When the dimensions froze out of the void, it became inexorably linked to Calabi-Yau space. The Chronovores may live in the time vortex, but they eat and feed in what you call Calabi-Yau space. You're trespassing on their feeding grounds. Arlene looked over at Paul. If the Doctor's right, perhaps we ought to rethink what we're doing. Paul laughed. Have you forgotten how these Time Lords played with Stuart? What they did to him? They just don't want us to learn their secrets. I'm going ahead with the run. The Doctor sighed. He didn't like it, but at least he would be around to pick up the pieces. He just hoped that that would be enough. Now that he had control of Angeliqua, the Master had sunk back into his Gospodar persona. Perfect Serbian manners and a very different face. Holographic image inducing was far better than the old mask routine. I understand that you have a very gifted young scientist at your university. Professor Kairos. Is that correct? She nodded. Paul. He's responsible for the Titan array. The Master was impressed by Angeliqua. It was rare to find such a malleable, obedient mind. The perfect tool for what he needed to do. And that would be the experiment designed to penetrate Calabi-Yau space. The bitterness was clear in her voice. Waste of money, if you ask me. But yes. That's the experiment. I would like to see this. This Titan array, Madam Whitefriar. Would that be possible? I'm sure I can arrange it. She looked at her watch. Actually, he's due to do another run about now. I know, because I had to sign off access to the grid. Over 1 exahertz of processing power. Do you know how much that costs? Dear lady, I can assure you that the university will be very well rewarded for its assistance. Very well rewarded. This woman was motivated by 2 things, a desire for money and a desire for revenge. Her avarice was understandable, a useful vice shared by so many of her fellow human beings. But the bitterness was something else. Even the low level of mind control the Master was using could sense the intensity of her feelings towards this Paul Kairos. But there was something unnatural about it. Something abnormal. A block in her mind. Come along, she was saying. The next run starts in 5 minutes, and I'm sure you don't want to miss it. With that, she was virtually out of the door. The Master smiled. If the Titan array was even half the machine that his initial scans had indicated, it was an even more perfect tool for his revenge than dear Angeliqua. The deep thrum of the university generators once again vibrated throughout their marble cube of the Titan chamber. Arlene and Paul were fussing around the control console, adjusting settings, tuning penetration parameters, checking readings and muttering to each other under hushed breaths. To Stuart, it was as if he was young again, he and Ruth preparing Tomtit for another run. A faint trace of envy momentarily crossed his mind, but how could he be jealous of Paul? The boy was a genius, and deserved to succeed. Stuart couldn't help thinking, though, would he and Ruth have won the Nobel Prize had the Master not intervened? Approaching full access to the grid, 950 petahertz now available, said Arlene, raising her voice about the vibration of the generators. 970,990. 1 exahertz. 1.1. Full access, Paul. She yelled. And full power from the generators, if you hadn't guessed, Paul replied, preparing to realize wave envelope. His hands danced over the chrome of the console, a dazzling blur reflected in their silver surface. Wave envelope beginning to form, realization in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we have realization, he announced. As he spoke, the ruby of the Titan core began to fluoresce, red radiance, playing over the white walls of the chamber like some demonic shadow play. Stuart moved closer to the console, trying to catch a glimpse of the readings, to see if this latest experiment was working. He was too involved to hear the door to the chamber open and close behind him. All systems go, I see. At the sound of the wheedling voice, Stuart turned round. Angelica, what do you want? The woman had an annoying habit of cropping up just where she wasn't wanted, such as at funding meetings. And here she was accompanied by a swarthy-looking fellow in an expensive suit who was watching the array's performance in rapt awe. Might I remind you, Professor Hyde, that my department funds this game of smoke and mirrors. I have every right to observe what you are spending my money on. Single quote. It was funny how Angelica considered the university's money to be her own. 2. Think that this woman had been one of his worst pupils, and now she was telling all what to do. Who's this? Asked Stuart. He nodded towards the elegantly dressed stranger. Might I remind you, Angelica, that the Titan array has level 1 security clearance. My name is Branko Gospodar, Professor Hyde. The accent was heavy. Eastern Europe. The man held out his hand. I have heard much of you and your protégé, Professor Kairos. He smiled, which gave Stuart the creeps. I am preparing to invest a considerable sum in this university. Before I did so, I wanted to see its crowning glory. He stepped forward and approached the master console. A fascinating device, Professor Kairos. Fascinating. Thank you, said Paul. The man caught him with a brutal uppercut, sending him flying across the chamber. He then began to alter the settings on the console, his hands darting across the chrome surface as if he knew what he was doing. Stuart attempted to pull him away, but the man gave him a shove in the chest that left him winded on the floor, then continued to tap away, even as Arlene grabbed his shoulders to no avail. A sickening sense of déjà vu came over Stuart. Surely it couldn't be him. Within moments, the results of the man's actions were alarmingly obvious. The regular pulsing of the Titan core became erratic, almost painful, as the red deepened from ruby to blood, washing across the walls. It was as if time itself had been wounded. The doctor almost knocked Angelica out of the way as he tried to reach the stranger, but seemed to falter, to slow, until he had stopped in his tracks, poised in an impossible position. Stuart suddenly realized that he too was immobilized. It was as if time were standing still. With a churning feeling in his stomach, Stuart realized that it was something he had felt before. 30 years ago. Out of the blood-red Titan core, a brilliant luminance began to form. Brightening and brightening until the red was gone, washed away by the terrible incandescence. Stuart found it impossible to pull his eyes away as it gained definition, the fuzzy blur concentrating and resolving into a massive firebird, its wings swooping above them. A deafening shriek filled the chamber as the firebird proclaimed its magnificence. It was a sight that Stuart had hoped never to see again. The Chronovores had returned.